Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've debated for years whether to share this experience. Most people I've told think I'm making it up or that I was confused about what I saw. But I know what happened that day in 2009 near Reading, and it still gives me chills thinking about it. I'd gone to visit my friend who had just moved to Reading, California. We had plans to do some hiking around Lake Shasta. I'd heard the views were amazing and I was excited to explore. Unfortunately, when I arrived, they had come down with some kind of stomach bug and were completely bedridden. After driving all that way and with perfect hiking weather, I decided to go alone rather than waste the trip. My friend recommended a particular trail that followed part of the lake's shoreline before climbing to some scenic overlooks. Just be careful going alone, they warned between trips to the bathroom. I assured them I'd be fine. I wasn't exactly a novice hiker. I had my day pack with water, lunch, first aid kit, map, and the usual essentials. Looking back, I wish I'd listened more carefully to that warning. The trailhead parking lot was pretty empty that morning, just 2 other cars. I remember checking the trail map at the information board and planning to hike to a viewpoint about 4 miles in, have lunch, and then head back. The weather was perfect, mid-70s, light breeze, blue skies. The first couple miles were uneventful and beautiful. The trail alternated between forest sections and open areas with views of the lake. I passed a middle-aged couple heading back to the trailhead who mentioned they'd seen a deer near the first overlook. I was keeping a good pace and reached that first viewpoint in about an hour. The view was stunning. Lake Shasta's blue water stretching out below, surrounded by forested hills. I took some photos, but decided to continue to the next overlook for lunch since I still had plenty of energy, and it was only about another mile, according to my map. This is where things started to feel off. As I continued past the first viewpoint, the trail dipped back into denser forest. The trees were taller here, blocking most of the sunlight. It was cooler, quieter. About 10 minutes into this section, I got this sudden, uncomfortable feeling of being watched. It was so intense that I actually stopped and turned around, expecting to see another hiker behind me. Nothing. I told myself I was being ridiculous, probably just spooked by being alone in an unfamiliar forest. I kept hiking, but the feeling didn't go away. It got stronger, actually. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees on either side of the trail. Still nothing visible, but that sensation of eyes on me remained. Then I heard a small thud to my right, maybe 30 yards away. Something had landed on the ground. I stopped and looked, but the undergrowth was too thick to see anything. I figured it was probably a pine cone or branch falling. Normal forest sounds, right? I continued walking, and about 2 minutes later, a rock, an actual rock about the size of a golf ball, landed on the trail about 10 feet behind me. This definitely wasn't a natural occurrence. Something or someone had thrown that rock. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone there?" No response, just the light breeze through the trees. I stood there for a few minutes, listening intently. I was starting to get nervous, but still tried to rationalize it. Maybe some kids playing pranks. But I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail since that couple, and they were heading back to the trailhead. I decided to keep going, but now I was on high alert. About 50 yards further, another rock landed on the trail ahead of me. This one was bigger, baseball-sized. It didn't just fall, it had been thrown with some force from the right side of the trail. "This isn't funny," I shouted. "Who's there?" Again, no response, just the eerie silence of the forest. I considered turning back, but the thought of returning through that same section of forest, potentially with someone following me, seemed worse than continuing forward to the open overlook ahead. So I pressed on, walking faster now. That's when I noticed the footsteps. not on the trail, but paralleling it maybe 30 yards to my right in the forest. They matched my pace exactly. When I walked, they walked. When I stopped, they stopped. It wasn't an echo. Something was pacing me through the trees. I tried varying my pace, speeding up, slowing down, stopping abruptly, and whatever it was, adjusted perfectly. This wasn't an animal randomly moving through the woods. This was deliberate tracking. My heart was pounding now. I was completely alone with something stalking me, and I still had at least half a mile to go before reaching the overlook and open terrain. "I know you're there," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "What do you want?" The footsteps stopped when I stopped to yell, then resumed when I started walking again. Whatever was following me wasn't interested in communicating. I practically jogged the rest of the way to the second overlook. When I finally broke through the tree line into the open viewing area, I immediately turned to scan the forest edge. Nothing emerged. The footsteps had stopped at the tree line. I sat down on a rock at the overlook, trying to calm my nerves while keeping my eyes fixed on the forest edge. The overlook was a rocky outcropping with views of the lake below, but right then I couldn't care less about the scenery. I was trying to decide what to do. My options weren't great. The trail was a simple out and back, which meant I had to return the same way I'd come. There was no cell service to call for help. I could wait and hope other hikers would come along, but what if they didn't? I couldn't stay there until dark. After about 20 minutes with no sign of movement from the forest edge, I decided to eat my lunch quickly and then head back. Maybe whatever had been following me had lost interest or moved on. I barely tasted my sandwich as I wolfed it down, keeping my eyes on the trees the entire time. Then I packed up, took a deep breath, and started back down the trail. As soon as I re-entered the forest, I heard it again, footsteps matching mine, now coming from my left side. But something else had changed. There was a new sound, a rhythmic knocking like wood striking wood. Knock, knock, pause, knock. It came from further away, maybe 100 yards to my left. Then an answering knock came from ahead of me and to the right. They were communicating. My blood ran cold. This wasn't some random animal. Whatever these things were, they were coordinating, boxing me in on the trail. I started walking faster, almost jogging. The footsteps kept pace. The knocking continued, changing positions around me. I had about 4 miles to go before reaching my car, and I was genuinely frightened now. I tried focusing on the trail ahead, watching my footing as I moved as quickly as I safely could. The forest seemed darker than before, the shadows deeper. Every noise made me flinch. A bird taking flight, a branch swaying in the breeze. The footsteps never fell behind, never got ahead, just maintained that consistent 30-yard distance, invisible behind the trees and undergrowth, but unmistakably there. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I was moving too fast and caught my foot on an exposed root. I went down hard, scraping my palms and twisting my knee. I cried out in pain as I hit the ground, my water bottle flying from my pack's side pocket. As I laid there wincing and checking my injured knee, the forest went completely silent. No footsteps, no knocking, nothing. Then I saw it. About 20 yards away, partially hidden behind a large tree trunk, stood a figure that made my breath catch in my throat. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and covered in reddish-brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like long hair hanging from its body. Where the hair parted or was thinner, I could see grayish skin beneath. Its proportions were all wrong for a human. Arms too long, shoulders too broad. It was watching me, not moving, not making a sound, just observing. I froze, afraid that any movement might provoke it. We stayed like that, locked in a bizarre standoff for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then, slowly, I reached for my water bottle. As I moved, it shifted slightly, adjusting its position behind the tree. I could see its face now, or part of it. Dark eyes set deep under a prominent brow ridge, a flat, broad nose. No expression I could read. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grasp the water bottle. I carefully tucked it back into my pack and then, using a nearby tree for support, pulled myself to my feet. My knee throbbed with pain, but adrenaline was overriding it. The creature didn't approach. It just watched as I tested my weight on my injured leg. I could walk, but there would be no more running. I started limping down the trail, not looking back, moving as quickly as my injured knee would allow. I expected to hear the footsteps resume, but there was nothing. After about 50 yards, I chanced to look back. The figure was gone. I kept moving, the silence now somehow more unnerving than the footsteps had been. Where had it gone? Was it still following, just more silently now, or had it lost interest once I was injured? My mind raced with questions as I limped the remaining distance to the trailhead. What was that thing? It looked like descriptions I'd heard of Bigfoot, but I'd always considered those stories to be campfire tales, not reality. Yet what I'd seen was undeniably real, too detailed, too specific to be a bear or other known animal. And the behavior, the rock throwing, the coordinated knocking, the deliberate pacing, suggested intelligence, awareness. It hadn't seemed aggressive, despite having multiple opportunities to attack. It had just watched, followed, observed. Even when I was vulnerable, lying injured on the ground, it had maintained its distance. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and just sat there shaking for several minutes. My knee was swollen, my palms raw from the fall, but the physical injuries seemed trivial compared to the mental shock of what I'd experienced. I've returned to that area several times since then, sometimes with others, trying to make sense of what happened. I've never seen the creature again, never experienced anything similar, but I know what I saw. I know it was real. And I know that something intelligent, something aware, something not recognized by conventional science, inhabits those woods around Lake Shasta. To this day, I can't explain exactly what it was or why it chose to follow me, rather than remain hidden or approach directly. All I know is that my understanding of what exists in our wilderness changed forever on that day. Story 2. I've never shared this with anyone outside my immediate family. It's been over 50 years now, but what happened that day in the fall of 1972 is still crystal clear in my mind. I was 14 then, just a skinny kid with a shotgun who thought he knew the woods. Growing up in rural Pennsylvania, hunting was part of life. My father had given me a 12-gauge double barrel for my birthday that summer, and I'd been practicing with it for months. By October, I was confident enough that my parents let me go squirrel hunting alone. That morning started like any other hunting day. I woke before sunrise, had a quick breakfast, grabbed my shotgun, and headed out while the world was still dark. The air had that crisp fall smell, decaying leaves, damp earth, and the faint mustiness that comes with autumn. I remember being able to see my breath as I walked. The spot I chose was along the Kinzua River, about 1.5 miles from our house. It was a good area for squirrels, plenty of oak trees dropping acorns, not too dense to shoot through the canopy. I'd been there dozens of times with my dad, but this was only my 3rd time alone. By mid-morning, I hadn't had much luck. I'd seen a couple of squirrels, but they were either too far away or moved before I could get a clear shot. The woods were quieter than usual. Normally, you'd hear birds, squirrels chattering, the occasional rustle of a rabbit or raccoon. But that day, there was just the sound of the river and the occasional breeze through the trees. Around 11 o'clock, I decided to take a break. There was this big, flat rock right on the riverbank that made a perfect seat. It was worn smooth from years of floodwater, about the size of a kitchen table. I settled down, laid my shotgun across my lap, and just watched the water flow by. The sun was warming up the day nicely, and I remember thinking I might eat my sandwich early. I'd been sitting there maybe 15 minutes when something changed. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a feeling. The woods felt different somehow. Then I heard it. Movement in the forest behind me. Not the quick scurry of a squirrel or even the cautious steps of a deer. This was steady, deliberate, heavy. My first thought was that another hunter had come into the area, though I hadn't heard any vehicles on the nearby dirt road. I turned slowly, not wanting to spook whatever game might be around. What I saw froze me to that rock. About 40 yards away, walking through the trees, was a figure, dark-haired, no, covered in dark hair, and walking upright on two legs. It was moving parallel to the river, not directly toward or away from me. The thing was huge, I'd say between 6 and 7 feet tall, with a build that made our high school football players look skinny. Its shoulders were incredibly wide, and its arms were long, too long, hanging down and swinging slightly as it walked. I remember thinking how smoothly it moved, not like a person crashing through undergrowth, but with a fluid, almost graceful motion despite its size. Each step was deliberate but efficient. It moved like it knew exactly where it was going and had walked these woods 1,000 times before. The creature, because I knew instantly it wasn't human, didn't seem to notice me. It never turned its head in my direction or changed its pace, just kept moving steadily through the trees, gradually disappearing deeper into the forest. I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart was hammering so hard, I was sure it would hear it. My mouth went completely dry, and I had the shotgun in a death grip across my lap. I remember thinking about raising it, but my arms wouldn't respond. And honestly, I don't know what I would have done if I had gotten the gun up. The 12 gauge suddenly felt like a toy in my hands. The strangest part was the silence. This thing made almost no noise as it moved through the forest. No branches breaking, no leaves crunching, just the faintest sound of movement, like a shadow passing through the trees. I know deer can be quiet, but even they snap a twig now and then. This was different. I couldn't see its face clearly. It never turned toward me. But I could make out the shape of its head, slightly conical at the top, sitting directly on those massive shoulders with barely any neck visible. The hair covering its body looked matted in places, especially around the shoulders and back. The whole encounter probably lasted less than a minute, but it felt like time had stopped. As the figure disappeared deeper into the trees, I stayed frozen on that rock, my eyes fixed on the spot where I'd last seen it. I was terrified it might circle back. For about 10 minutes, though it honestly felt like hours, I just sat there, not moving a muscle, barely breathing. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. A bear walking upright, some crazy person in a costume, but it moved too naturally to be someone in a suit, and no bear I'd ever seen walked that way for that long. Eventually, the woods returned to normal. Birds started calling again. A squirrel chattered somewhere nearby. The immediate sense of danger began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming urge to get the hell out of there. When I finally got the courage to stand up, my legs were shaking so badly I almost fell over. I remember checking my watch. It was almost noon, though it felt like days had passed. I didn't run, exactly. Running felt like it might trigger something primal, like it might draw attention or chase. Instead, I walked as quickly and quietly as I could, shotgun ready, eyes scanning constantly. The walk home was the longest 1.5 miles of my life. Every shadow looked like a massive, hair-covered figure. Every sound made me flinch. I kept to the trail but stopped frequently to look behind me, sure I was being followed. The weight of eyes on my back was so intense I could physically feel it. When I finally reached the edge of the woods near our property, I broke into a run across the open field to our house. I burst through the back door, out of breath and sweating despite the cool weather. My mum was in the kitchen making lunch. She turned, surprised to see me back so early, and asked if I'd had any luck. I mumbled something about not seeing many squirrels and went straight to my room. I couldn't tell her. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? That night at dinner, my dad asked about the hunting trip. I made up some story about getting bored and coming home early. He seemed disappointed. He'd been proud of me going out alone, but didn't push it. I barely touched my food. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares. Always the same. I'd be sitting on that rock and I'd hear something behind me. But in the dreams, when I turned around, the creature would be right there, reaching for me with those impossibly long arms. I'd wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. I didn't go hunting alone again that season. When my dad asked why, I claimed I was focusing on school. By the next fall, we'd moved to a different part of the county for my dad's job, and I never went back to those specific woods. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was just a bear with mange. Maybe it was some kind of prank. But deep down, I know what I saw was real, and it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist. The strangest part is how it ignored me completely. I was just a kid with a gun, completely vulnerable, and it walked by like I wasn't even there. Sometimes I wonder if that was luck, or if it knew exactly where I was and simply chose not to acknowledge me. I've read accounts since then, stories from people who've had similar experiences in those Pennsylvania woods. Some call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others use local names, the Albatwitch or the Forest Guardian. I don't know what name fits what I saw. I just know it was real, it was there. And for some reason, it let me go home that day. I'm 54 now, and I've never gone hunting alone since. I still go into the woods, still fish the rivers, but always with someone else. And I'm always listening, always aware of what's moving around me. Sometimes when I'm out there, I get that same feeling I had that day. Like something's watching, something that doesn't want to be seen but could show itself if it chose to. When that happens, I make my excuses and head back to the car, no matter how good the fishing is. I've often wondered what would have happened if I'd raised that shotgun. Would it have charged me? Would I even be here to tell this story? Or maybe nothing would have happened at all. Maybe it would have just kept walking, indifferent to my presence. The most disturbing thought, the one that still keeps me awake sometimes, is that maybe it didn't acknowledge me because it didn't need to. Maybe it knew exactly where I was from the moment I entered those woods. Maybe I was never the hunter that day. I don't have answers, just the memory of those few moments and the absolute certainty that what I saw wasn't supposed to exist. It's been over 50 years, but I can still see it clearly. That dark figure moving silently through the trees, briefly sharing the forest with a terrified kid who just happened to be sitting on the wrong rock at the wrong time. What bothers me most isn't the creature itself. It's that I'll never know for sure what it was. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet, I can't shake the feeling that someday I might find out. Story 3. I've been meaning to write this down for a while now. I keep thinking about it almost every day, and I figured putting it into words might help me process what happened. I'm still trying to make sense of it all. About 8 months ago, I went through a pretty messy divorce. Tom and I had been together for almost 11 years, and when things fell apart, I was completely lost. My sister Audrey suggested I join her on a business trip to France. She thought getting away would help clear my head, and honestly, I needed the distraction. Audrey had meetings scheduled for most of the week in Lyon, but we decided to spend a few days in this tiny village about an hour's drive from the city. It was one of those picturesque places that doesn't even show up on most maps. Stone cottages, narrow winding streets, and locals who still greeted each other by name. We found this charming little Airbnb, a converted stone cottage with exposed wooden beams and a garden overlooking rolling hills. Our host, Marcel, was an older gentleman who spoke decent English. He lived in the main house and rented out the cottage at the back of his property. The first night, he brought us homemade bread and local cheese, and we chatted about the area. I mentioned I was looking forward to exploring while Audrey attended her meetings. The village is very safe to walk around, Marcel said, refilling our wine glasses. The bakery opens at 6 in the morning, and Madame Fournier makes the best pain au chocolat in the region. What about hiking? I asked. I saw some woods nearby when we drove in. Marcel's expression changed so quickly it caught me off guard. The forest? Yes, it is beautiful in daylight. Many trails, color-coded, very organized. He paused, then added firmly, "But you must return before sunset. Never walk in those woods after dark." I laughed a little. Bears? Wolves? He didn't smile back. No bears, no wolves. Not for many years. But the locals, they believe something lives in those woods. Something old. Most visitors think it's just superstition, but those of us who have lived here all our lives, we respect these beliefs. I didn't take his warning seriously. Coming from the Pacific Northwest, I was used to stories about Bigfoot and other forest creatures. I'd always been fascinated by cryptozoology. I even studied anthropology in college and did my thesis on cultural mythology around unidentified creatures. But it was always academic for me, never something I actually believed in. The next morning, Audrey left early for her meetings in Lyon. After breakfast, I asked Marcel for directions to the forest. He seemed hesitant, but eventually drew me a simple map. Follow the road past the church, then take the dirt path for about half a mile. You will see the entrance with the wooden sign. Remember, be back before sunset. It was a beautiful spring day, cool but sunny. I packed a small backpack with water, a sandwich, my phone, and a paperback. The walk to the forest was easy, just as Marcel had described. When I reached the entrance, I found a carved wooden sign with a map showing color-coded trails. Green was the shortest at 2 miles, blue was medium length, and red was the longest at about 5 miles. The forest itself looked like something from a fairy tale. Tall trees with dappled sunlight filtering through, moss-covered stones, and wildflowers dotting the path. Every half mile or so, there were hand-painted wooden benches where hikers could rest. Each bench matched the trail color, green benches on the green trail, and so on. I decided to take the green trail since it was already past noon. The path was well maintained but quiet. I didn't see any other hikers, which surprised me given how beautiful the area was. About midway through the loop, I found a green bench in a small clearing and decided to take a break. I sat down, opened my book, and unwrapped my sandwich. That's when I first noticed something was off. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird song, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just this heavy, pressing silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that when the forest goes quiet, it usually means something has spooked the wildlife. I packed up my things and was about to leave when I heard a sound from deep in the trees, away from the path. It was hard to describe, not quite human, not quite animal. Almost like someone trying to mimic speech without knowing the language, a series of grunts and whoops that had a rhythm to them, almost like they were trying to communicate something. My first thought was that it might be other hikers messing around, so I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" My voice sounded thin and small in the silence. The strange vocalizations stopped immediately. Then came a different sound. Loud banging, like something hitting the trees. It wasn't rhythmic like a woodpecker. It was forceful, angry, then crashing noises, branches breaking. Whatever was making those sounds was big and moving fast. I stood frozen on the path, my heart hammering in my chest. I should have left right then, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. I'd spent years studying stories about forest creatures, and some small part of me wondered if I was actually experiencing something extraordinary. That's when I saw them. A pair of bright yellow eyes staring at me from between the trees, about 50 yards off the path. They were too high up to be a deer or boar, maybe 7 feet off the ground. And they were huge, much larger than human eyes, with a strange reflective quality that made them shine even in the daylight. A low, rumbling growl came from the same direction, a sound that vibrated through my chest and turned my blood to ice. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard. It had depth and resonance that seemed almost impossible. I took a step back, and that's when it moved. God, I'll never forget this as long as I live. This creature stepped out from behind a cluster of trees. I've gone over this moment in my head thousands of times, questioning if what I saw was real, but I know what I saw. It was massive, easily 10 or 12 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, almost black in places, with a lighter brown mane around what I can only describe as its face. The face itself was the most disturbing part. It was surprisingly human-like, but with proportions all wrong. A heavy brow, a wide nose, and a pronounced underbite that exposed large yellowed teeth that looked disturbingly human. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging almost to its ankles, with huge hands that could have wrapped around my entire torso. The legs were thick and powerful, slightly bent at the knees. Large pointed ears stuck out from the sides of its head, twitching and moving independently like a cat's. But it was the eyes that haunted me the most. Those bright yellow eyes had intelligence in them. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just an animal. It was looking at me with what I can only describe as anger and recognition. It reared up to its full height and let out a roar that physically pushed the air around me. The sound was deafening, part howl, part scream, with a depth that made my ribcage vibrate. I dropped my backpack and stumbled backward, nearly falling. The creature then began pounding on the trees around it, breaking off branches and throwing them. It wasn't random destruction. It felt deliberate, like a warning display. It would hit a tree, then look at me, hit another tree, look at me again. After what felt like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, it made a sound that was almost like disgust, a huffing, snorting noise, then turned and walked away. Its gait was strange, hunched and swinging, but it moved with surprising speed and agility for something so large. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I grabbed my backpack and ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't stop until I reached the forest entrance, gasping for breath, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. When I got back to the cottage, Marcel was in the garden. One look at my face and he knew something had happened. I blurted out everything I'd seen, the words tumbling out in a confused rush. His face went pale. "You saw it?" he said. Not a question, but a statement. "What was it?" I asked, still shaking. "Some kind of bear? An escaped animal?" Marcel shook his head. "We don't speak of them," he said. "But they have been here longer than we have." He was visibly upset, almost angry. He went inside and made a phone call, speaking rapid French I couldn't understand. That evening, several villagers came to Marcel's house. They spoke to him in hushed tones, occasionally glancing at me. I caught words like attira, attract, and malchance, bad luck. The mood was tense, hostile even. The next morning, Marcel informed us we needed to leave. He refunded the remaining nights, but insisted we had to go immediately. Audrey was furious, but I convinced her not to argue. I explained what happened as we drove back to Lyon, and she told me what she'd pieced together from overhearing the villagers. Apparently, the locals believed these creatures were bad omens. They respected their territory and never entered the forest after dark. By ignoring the warning and encountering one of them, I had somehow broken an unspoken pact and brought potential misfortune to the village. It sounds crazy, I know. Before that day, I would have dismissed it as superstition. But what I saw was real. It wasn't a man in a costume or a known animal. It was something else entirely. Since then, I've had 2 more encounters with what I believe were Bigfoot-type creatures back home in the Pacific Northwest, but neither compared to what I saw in France. That first real encounter changed everything for me. What was once just an academic interest has become something more, a passion, maybe even an obsession. I've connected with other researchers and witnesses, comparing notes and experiences. The creature I saw in France doesn't match the typical North American Bigfoot descriptions. Some researchers think it might be what Europeans call a woodwose, or wild man. Others suggest it could be something more ancient, something that's been there since before human civilization. I still dream about those yellow eyes and that deep rumbling growl. I still wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed on that green bench a moment longer. Most of all, I wonder how many other creatures are out there, hiding just beyond our awareness, in forests and mountains around the world. Whatever it was, that day in France changed me forever. I know now that there are things in this world that defy our understanding, creatures that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to discover. Story 4. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but I need to get it off my chest after all these years. What I'm about to tell you happened in September of 1998, and it's completely changed how I feel about being in the woods. I was working with a logging crew in Clallam County, Washington. We were a team of 7 guys, all experienced woodsmen who'd spent years cutting timber across the Pacific Northwest. The job was pretty standard. We had a 4-week contract to clear about 30 acres of old-growth forest. The location was remote, about 23 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a winding dirt access path barely wide enough for our equipment trucks. Our base camp was set up in a small clearing about half a mile from where we were cutting. We had 3 large canvas tents for sleeping, a supply tent with our food and cooking gear, and a central area where we kept our generator, tools and fuel drums. Nothing fancy, but it was functional, and we'd used this same setup dozens of times before. The first day went normally. We cut from sunrise until about 5 in the afternoon, came back to camp tired and dirty like usual, had dinner, and sat around shooting the shit before turning in. Normal stuff. Nothing weird at all. It was during our second night that things started to change. I was asleep in one of the tents with 2 other guys when I woke up around 2 in the morning. At first I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. Maybe I needed to take a piss or something. But then I heard it. Heavy footsteps moving around the perimeter of our camp clearing. Really heavy, not like a deer or even a bear. These were deliberate, rhythmic steps that made the ground vibrate slightly with each impact. I sat up and listened, thinking maybe one of the guys was walking around, but I could hear everyone's breathing in the tents. I nudged Mike, the guy sleeping next to me, and he woke up instantly. He heard it too. We sat there in the darkness, listening as whatever it was continued pacing the edge of our camp, circling us. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered. I grabbed my flashlight, and we cautiously unzipped the tent. Outside, the night was pitch black except for the dim glow of our banked campfire. I swept the beam around the clearing, trying to catch sight of whatever was making those footfalls, but the light didn't penetrate more than 15 or 20 feet into the surrounding forest. The footsteps stopped when we came outside, and after about 10 minutes of standing there like idiots with our flashlights, we finally convinced ourselves it was probably just a bear or something. "Probably just curious," Mike said, not sounding entirely convinced. "Let's get back to sleep." But I noticed neither of us turned off our flashlights after we got back into our sleeping bags. The next morning, we told the rest of the crew about what we'd heard. A couple of the guys laughed it off, but our foreman Dave took it seriously enough to suggest we keep our work axes and the camp shotgun closer at night. Dave had worked these forests for over 20 years and wasn't the type to get spooked easily. "Might be a big cat," he said, referring to the possibility of a cougar. "They sometimes get curious about camps." That day at work felt different. I kept getting this feeling like we were being watched. Several times, I stopped cutting and just stared into the dense forest around us, half expecting to see something looking back. The others must have felt it too, because conversation was minimal and everyone seemed on edge. When we got back to camp that evening, Dave suggested we build the fire up bigger than usual. Nobody argued. We ate dinner mostly in silence, each of us periodically scanning the tree line. As it got darker, that feeling of being observed grew stronger. I remember thinking how isolated we really were. Miles from anywhere, surrounded by ancient trees that blocked out most of the sky. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Around midnight, it started again, the footsteps. But this time, they were louder, closer to camp, and there was a purpose to them that hadn't been there the night before. They'd moved to one side of the clearing, stopped for a minute or two, then continued to another position. By this point, everyone in our tent was awake. I could hear movement from the other tents too. Dave came out first, shotgun in hand, and the rest of us followed. We stood in a loose circle, all facing outward with our flashlights. The footsteps had stopped when we emerged, but we could all feel something was there, just beyond where our lights could reach. "Hello?" Dave called out. "Anyone there?" No response, just the normal night sounds of the forest temporarily going quiet at his voice. "This is private property," he continued. "If someone's out there, you need to identify yourself." The silence stretched for maybe 30 seconds. Then, from the darkness beyond our lights, came a low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt. It was deep. You could feel it in your chest more than hear it. Dave fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the trees, and then everything went silent. We stood there, tense, waiting. Then from uphill, maybe 50 yards away, there came 3 distinct, powerful thuds, like something massive striking a tree trunk with tremendous force. Boom, boom, boom. The entire forest seemed to vibrate with each impact. "What the fuck was that?" someone whispered behind me. Nobody answered. We stayed up the rest of the night, keeping the fire blazing and taking turns, watching the perimeter while the others tried to get some rest. But I don't think anyone actually slept. The next morning, Dave radioed our contact at the timber company and explained what was happening. They offered to send someone out, but it would take at least a day for them to reach us. Dave told them to hold off. We'd stick it out one more night and see what happened. That third day at work was hell. We were all exhausted and jumpy. Twice we had to stop work because guys thought they saw movement in the forest. Each time we found nothing, but that didn't make us feel any better. We knocked off early and headed back to camp around 3 in the afternoon. That evening, we reinforced our camp as best we could. We positioned the trucks to form a partial barrier, stacked our equipment in a way that would make noise if disturbed, and kept the fire roaring. Dave had the shotgun loaded with slugs now, not just the bird shot he'd fired as a warning the night before. We also had our axes, chainsaws, and a couple of guys had hunting knives. In hindsight, I realize how ridiculous we must have looked. 7 grown men armed to the teeth and terrified of the dark. Night fell, and the forest around us seemed to press in closer. The normal sounds, insects, the occasional owl, the rustle of wind through the trees, all seemed muffled as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It was just after 10 o'clock when it happened. We were all still up, sitting around the fire, nobody wanting to be the first to suggest turning in. There was a sudden crash from the direction of our supply area, like something large had bulldozed through the underbrush. We all jumped up, grabbing our lights and weapons. The beam of my flashlight caught it first. Standing near our generator was something. I've spent 20 years in the woods, and I've never seen anything like it before or since. It stood upright, between 8 and 9 feet tall, covered in dark, shaggy hair, not fur like a bear. This was longer, matted in places, with a slightly reddish tint where the light hit it directly. Its body was massive, broad shoulders tapering to a narrower waist, with long, powerful arms that hung down almost to its knees. But it was the face that froze my blood. Its features were a twisted version of human, a heavy brow ridge shadowing deep-set eyes that caught our flashlight beams and reflected back amber, almost glowing in the darkness. Its nose was wide and flat, and when it opened its mouth, I could see large, square teeth. For what felt like an eternity, we all just stood there staring at each other. Then it moved, so fast it seemed impossible for something that size. With one hand, it shoved over a 50-gallon fuel drum like it was knocking over a soda can. Diesel spilled across the ground as the drum rolled. With its other hand, it grabbed one of our metal toolboxes and flung it aside. That box weighed at least 70 pounds, and it tossed it 20 feet like it was nothing. Holy shit. somebody whispered beside me. The creature's head snapped in our direction. It let out a noise I'll never forget, starting as a low growl that built into a roar so powerful I could feel it vibrating in my teeth. It reached down, grabbed one of our tent poles that was leaning against a crate and snapped it in half like it was a toothpick. Dave fired a shot into the air. The creature flinched at the sound but didn't run. Instead, it turned directly toward us, bared those massive square teeth, and made a sound that was unmistakably a threat. Then, in a blur of movement that my brain still can't fully process, it was gone, crashing back through the brush with such speed and power that small trees actually bent in its wake. We stood there, weapons still raised, for several minutes before anyone spoke. Finally, Dave lowered the shotgun. "Everyone okay?" he asked, his voice unsteady. We nodded, still too shocked to speak. "Pack up," Dave said. "We're leaving, now." Nobody argued. We threw our essential gear into the trucks, not even bothering with the tents. As we worked, I noticed large impressions in the soft ground near where the creature had stood. Footprints, approximately 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They were pressed nearly 2 inches into the hard-packed earth of our camp. It took us less than 30 minutes to load up and get out of there. We drove through the night on that terrible access road, headlights bouncing off the trees, everyone scanning the forest as we went. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? We did eventually go back with company representatives to collect the rest of our equipment and finish the job. We worked only during daylight hours and stayed in a motel 20 miles away each night. The company wrote off the damaged equipment without asking many questions. That was over 20 years ago, and I've never told this story to anyone outside of the crew who was there. We were all hard, practical men, loggers who'd spent our lives in the wilderness. We weren't the type to believe in monsters or make up stories. But what we saw that night in Clallam County wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a suit, wasn't anything I can explain. I still work in the industry, but I haven't spent a night camping in remote woods since then. Some of the guys quit logging altogether. Whatever that thing was, it had been watching us, testing us, for days before it finally decided to show itself. It wasn't just passing through, it was deliberately intimidating us, letting us know we weren't welcome. When I hear stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch, I don't laugh anymore. I don't know what to call what we saw that night, but I know it was real, and I know it's still out there somewhere in those endless Washington forests. Story 5. We've lived on our property near Cinnabar, Washington for about 11 years now. It's a beautiful spot in the Cascade foothills, 15 acres of mostly wooded land. When we first moved in, we logged most of it, except for this small area where we created a pet cemetery. It sounds morbid, I know, but we wanted a peaceful spot to remember our animals that had passed. Back in August of 2011, I had this idea to set up a mole camera to catch some of the wildlife on our property. Nothing fancy, just a basic trail cam. I've always been curious about what animals pass through when we're not looking or sleeping. I set it up facing one of the clearings near the ridgeline, and honestly, I kind of forgot about it for a while. On August 27th, at around 11:41 at night, the camera picked up something that still makes my skin crawl. It wasn't the visual that got me, it was the audio. These strange whooping calls came from the ridgeline. Not coyotes, not elk, not any animal I recognize, and I've lived in rural areas my entire life. The calls had this rhythm to them, almost like they were communicating something specific. When I played it for my husband, he got really quiet, which isn't like him at all. I tried to brush it off, but those sounds stuck with me. I started paying more attention to noises at night, and honestly, we began hearing stuff pretty regularly. Weird knocks, calls that seemed to answer each other from different areas of the property. My husband tried to rationalize it, maybe teens messing around, maybe some animal we weren't familiar with. But deep down, I think we both knew it was something else. Then January came, January 22nd to be exact. We'd had a decent snow, but it was starting to melt. I went out to check on our bird feeders when I noticed something weird in the yard. At first, I thought maybe deer had come through, but as I got closer, I realized these weren't deer tracks. They were these bizarre impressions in the snow, almost in a dotted line, with each step consistently 5 to 6 feet apart. Who or what takes steps that far apart? The tracks ran in this freakishly straight line between trees before they just stopped at our property line. Like whatever made them knew exactly where our land ended. They weren't human prints, too large, wrong shape, and definitely not a dog or any other four-legged animal I know. I called my husband out, and he stood there scratching his head, totally confused. "What the hell made these?" he kept saying. I didn't have an answer then. I'm not sure I have one now. But the really unsettling stuff happened in June of that year. I had a friend over, we'll call her Kay, and we decided to walk around the property. It was a nice day, and we headed toward the pet cemetery area. As we got closer, Kay pointed out something strange. The rock piles we'd made to mark the graves looked different. They had been moved, but not scattered like an animal would do. It was more like they'd been carefully rearranged. While we were looking at the rocks, Kay spotted something else nearby. There were 10 small bundles of grass, each about the size of my palm, lined up in this weirdly perfect row. I remember thinking how unnatural it looked. Nature doesn't arrange things in neat rows like that. We were just bending down to look at them when both my dogs, who had been running around happily, suddenly went rigid. Their hackles went up, and they started growling toward the tree line about 30 feet away. I was trying to calm them down when I felt something whiz past my ear and then a sharp pain in my thumb. A rock about the size of a golf ball had flown out from the direction the dogs were looking and hit me. I want to be clear. This rock didn't fall from a tree or roll down a hill. It was thrown with force, with aim. It hit me directly on the thumb, hard enough to leave a bruise. Kek and I looked at each other, and I could see she was as freaked out as I was. "We need to go," she whispered. The dogs were still growling, and I felt like we were being watched. As we backed away, I grabbed one of the grass bundles, not really thinking about why. I just wanted evidence of something. Once we were back at the house, I carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a field mouse, completely intact, but dead. It was wrapped up like a little package, not mangled or partially eaten like you'd expect if a predator had done it. Just neatly wrapped in grass. I went back later, not alone, I'm not crazy, and checked the other bundles. Each one contained a mouse wrapped the same way. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who or what catches mice and wraps them in grass bundles? What was the purpose? Were they left as some kind of, I don't know, offering? Warning? I couldn't make sense of it. A few days later, I contacted some local researchers who investigate unusual phenomena in the woods. They came out and photographed everything, the grass bundles, the rock that hit me, and then something else we found that made my blood run cold. Near the pet cemetery, partially hidden in some soft dirt, were footprints, not human footprints. One was about 8 inches long, like a child's print, but wider and with a different structure. Near it were larger prints, around 15 inches with 5 distinct toes. The investigators measured them, photographed them from different angles, and made casts. These are juvenile and adult Sasquatch prints. One of them told me matter-of-factly, like he was telling me the weather. I think I laughed nervously, but the guy didn't crack a smile. He was dead serious. I've never really believed in Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I mean, I've watched the shows and thought they were entertaining, but I never thought I'd be standing on my own property looking at what someone was telling me were actual Sasquatch footprints. And yet, there they were, and I couldn't explain them any other way. About 2 weeks after the investigators left, my husband decided to try something. He's always been more open-minded about this stuff than me. He took 3 apples and placed them in the crook of a tree near where we'd found the grass bundles. He didn't tell me until after he'd done it. "It's just an offering," he said, "to show whatever's out there that we mean no harm." I thought it was silly, but I didn't argue. The next morning I went to check, half expecting the apples to still be there. They weren't. Well, not entirely. 2 were completely gone, and the third had been eaten about 80% through. But here's the weird part. That partially eaten apple had been placed exactly where the mice bundles had been found. Not randomly dropped, but deliberately placed. I brought it back to the house to show my husband. We examined the tooth marks, and they were wrong. Too large for a human mouth, but smaller than what you'd expect from an adult Sasquatch, according to the investigators who had shown us photos of alleged Sasquatch bite marks. There was a distinct ridge down the center of each bite and a noticeable gap between what would be the front teeth. "It's the juvenile," my husband whispered, "the one that made the smaller tracks." I didn't want to believe it, but what other explanation made sense? Whatever was out there had accepted our offering and left something in return, placed in a specific spot that had meaning. It felt like communication. Since then, we've had more experiences. The whooping calls continue, sometimes so close to the house that they wake us up at night. We've found more track impressions, especially after it rains. Sometimes small items from our yard go missing. A garden trowel, a bird feeder, once even my husband's work glove that he'd left outside. The thing that really gets to me, though, is that I feel watched whenever I'm outside now. It's not always a threatening feeling, more like curiosity, like something is studying us, learning about us. Sometimes I talk out loud when I'm gardening, explaining what I'm doing. I know how that sounds, but it feels right somehow. My husband has started leaving more food offerings, fruits mostly, sometimes nuts or berries. They're always taken, and sometimes something is left in return. Interesting rocks, a feather arranged in a pattern, once even a small carved piece of wood that looks like it could be a toy. I still don't know what to call what's happening on our property. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, forest people, the name doesn't really matter. What matters is that there's something intelligent out there, something that communicates, leaves gifts, has family units with juveniles and adults, something that knows where our property line is and respects it most of the time. I haven't told many people about this. I'm not looking to be on TV or have our property overrun with curious strangers. I just needed to tell someone who might understand, who might have experienced something similar. Sometimes I wonder if they've always been there, and we've just been too blind or closed-minded to notice. The mouse bundles still haunt me the most. 10 little lives carefully wrapped up and presented, not killed violently, not eaten, just offered. But why? What were they trying to tell us? And why did they aim that rock at my thumb specifically? Not my head, not my body, just enough to get my attention. I still go out to that pet cemetery sometimes, though never alone. I talk to whatever might be listening. I tell them about my day, about the animals we've loved and lost. I don't know if they understand my words, but I think they understand my intentions. And sometimes when I'm there at dusk and the forest goes quiet except for those distinctive whoops from the ridgeline, I realize I'm not afraid anymore. Unsettled sometimes, yes. Confused often, but not afraid. Whatever they are, I don't think they want to harm us. I think they're just trying in their own way to connect. Story 6. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that night in 2014. I was 16 at the time, and a bunch of us had managed to convince our parents to let us camp at my friend Jake's summer house on Lake Huron. His parents owned this massive 20-acre property right on the lakefront in Michigan, completely isolated from neighbors or anything resembling civilization. It was supposed to be the ultimate summer freedom experience. No parents, just us teenagers hanging out, swimming, and doing whatever we wanted. There were 5 of us all together. Me, Jake, Mitch, Trevor, and Dylan. We arrived around midday and immediately started setting up our tents near the edge of the property. Jake's parents had said we could use the cabin if we wanted, but we were all pumped about roughing it outside. We were idiots, I guess. The cabin seemed too comfortable, too safe. We wanted the full outdoor experience. The day was perfect. We swam in the lake, had a massive cookout on the fire pit, and just goofed around like teenagers do. But as evening approached, the place started feeling different. The sun set early behind the tree line, and with barely any moonlight, the darkness that engulfed us was absolute. I'm talking pitch black beyond the reach of our campfire. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face if you stepped 10 feet away from the flames. Jake had warned us that the property backed up against a dense forest that stretched for miles. There's nothing out there but trees and wildlife, he'd said earlier. That sounded cool during daylight hours, but now with darkness pressing in from all sides, it felt oppressive. Around 8 or 9, we decided to explore the shoreline with our flashlights. The lake was calm that night, almost eerily still. The water lapped gently against the shore, and our voices seemed to carry forever across the surface. We skipped rocks and talked about school starting again in a few weeks. Normal stuff. But I kept getting this crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like something was watching us from the tree line behind. "You guys feel like we're being watched?" I remember asking. Trevor laughed it off. "It's just the dark playing tricks on you, man. There's nothing out here." I tried to convince myself he was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Eventually, we headed back to the campfire around 11:30. We were all sitting around, telling stupid ghost stories and trying to freak each other out, when I first noticed something wasn't right. Our tents were set up maybe 30 feet from the fire in a rough semicircle. I had just thrown another log on when I heard it, a rustling sound coming from one of our empty tents. Not the wind blowing the fabric kind of rustling, but the deliberate movement of something inside. "Guys, shut up for a second," I whispered, holding up my hand. "Listen." Everyone went quiet, and sure enough, there it was again, movement inside Trevor's tent. "Did you leave food in there?" Jake asked Trevor. "No way, man. We put everything in the coolers, like you said." The rustling continued, more pronounced now. Whatever was in there was big enough to make the whole tent move. "Probably a raccoon or something," Mitch suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. I stood up, trying to act braver than I felt. "I'll check it out." I grabbed the nearest flashlight and a stick from our firewood pile. "Dude, be careful," Dylan called after me, but nobody volunteered to come with me. I approached slowly, pointing the flashlight beam directly at the tent. The rustling stopped momentarily, as if whatever was inside had noticed my approach. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound intimidating despite my voice cracking. "Get out of there!" Nothing. I moved closer, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I was about 10 feet away when I decided to try again. "I'm serious. Get out now, or I'm coming in after you." That's when it happened. The tent suddenly erupted with movement. The front flap burst open, and something massive came charging out. I stumbled backwards so fast I fell on my ass, the flashlight flying from my hand and spinning across the ground. In the chaotic seconds that followed, I caught only glimpses of the creature as it bolted past me and disappeared into the darkness beyond our campsite. It was enormous, way bigger than any person I'd ever seen. Had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. It ran hunched over, with no visible neck, just a head that seemed to meld directly into its shoulders. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging limply as it ran, swinging with each stride. But the most terrifying part was that it was completely covered in hair, a shaggy coat that wasn't quite as thick as an ape's, but definitely not clothing. In the brief flash of light I caught, the hair looked dark brown or black. I scrambled back to the campfire, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. "What the fuck was that?" Trevor shouted. He and Mitch had seen it too. "Did you guys see that?" I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. "Tell me you saw that." Jake was white as a sheet. I saw something run into the woods. It was huge. Dylan was the only one who hadn't gotten a good look, as he'd been facing the other direction when it happened. "What are you guys talking about? What was it?" None of us wanted to say it out loud. It seemed too ridiculous, too impossible. It looked like. Mitch started, then shook his head. "Nah, that's crazy." "Like a Bigfoot," I finally said, the word hanging in the air between us. No one laughed. No one called me an idiot. They'd seen it too. We spent the next hour huddled around the fire, flashlights pointed outward in every direction. No one wanted to go near the tents. Trevor's was completely trashed. Whatever had been inside had torn through his sleeping bag and scattered his belongings everywhere. What was it looking for? Jake wondered aloud. Food, probably, Dylan suggested. Aren't bears attracted to food smells? That wasn't a bear, Mitch said firmly. Bears don't run on two legs like that. We debated what to do. It was after midnight, and none of us wanted to walk the quarter-mile up to the cabin in the dark. At the same time, staying by the tents seemed like the worst possible idea. We should make the fire bigger, Jake suggested. Most animals are afraid of fire, right? We gathered every piece of wood we could find, without venturing too far from the firelight, and built it up until the flames were leaping 5 feet into the air. The heat was intense, but the comfort of the light outweighed the discomfort. None of us slept that night. We just sat around the fire, jumping at every sound from the surrounding woods. The worst part was knowing there was something out there, possibly watching us, while we couldn't see more than a few yards into the darkness. Around 4 in the morning, we heard it again. Crashing sounds in the underbrush maybe 100 yards away. Then silence. As dawn finally broke around 5:30, we all breathed a collective sigh of relief. In the grey morning light, everything seemed less threatening. We decided to pack up our stuff and move to the cabin for the rest of the trip. While we were cleaning up, it happened again. The sound started as a low rumble, barely audible at first. Then it grew into deep, powerful grunts mixed with these weird wooing sounds of varying pitch. It was coming from the tree line, just out of sight. "Holy shit," Trevor whispered. "What is that?" "I don't know, but I'm not sticking around to find out," I said, grabbing my backpack. We abandoned half our gear and practically ran to the cabin, not looking back once. From the safety of the cabin's porch, we scanned the tree line but saw nothing. For the remaining 3 days of our trip, we stayed close to the cabin. We fished during daylight hours and even ventured down to the lake, but as soon as the sun started setting, we locked ourselves inside. We heard the same sounds each night, distant grunts and calls that didn't match any animal we knew of. On our last night, Jake's dad called to check in on us. Jake didn't tell him about what we'd seen, just said we were having a great time. After he hung up, I asked him why he hadn't mentioned it. "Would you believe us?" he replied. "My dad would think we were making it up or that we were drinking or something." He was right. Even now, 10 years later, I still question what I saw that night. But then I remember the absolute terror I felt, the way that creature moved, and I know it was real. We never went back to camp at that property again. Jake's family still owns it, and occasionally he'll mention that his dad has found strange tree structures on the property, branches twisted and snapped in ways that don't occur naturally. I've read about Bigfoot encounters since then, and so many details match what we experienced. The vocalizations, the height, the way it moved. I don't try to convince skeptics anymore. I know what I saw, even if I can't explain it. To this day, I still can't sleep in a tent. The sound of canvas rustling in the wind is enough to send my heart racing back to that summer night on Lake Huron, when something impossible stepped out of the darkness and into our lives. Story 7. I still can't believe what happened that summer night in 2005. I've spent years trying to make sense of it, questioning my own sanity at times. I've only told this story to a handful of people, and most either think I'm crazy or lying. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. I was 23 at the time, living in Federal Way, Washington. It was early August, one of those perfect Pacific Northwest summer evenings where the air feels clean and the temperature is just right. Me, Ryan, and Kelly had just finished our softball game with the recreational league we'd joined that summer. We weren't particularly good, but it was fun, and we'd actually managed to win that day. We headed back to Ryan's place afterward to have a couple beers before meeting some other friends at Applebee's later that night. Ryan's backyard was pretty typical for the area. A concrete patio where we sat on plastic chairs, a makeshift basketball court with a hoop mounted above the garage, and a fully fenced yard that sloped uphill toward the back. At the top of the slope in the far corner sat an old wooden shed where Ryan kept his lawnmower and gardening tools. Beyond the fence was a thick line of evergreen trees that separated Ryan's property from the neighbors behind him. The sun was just starting to set, casting this golden light through the trees. It was peaceful, normal. Just three friends drinking beer and talking shit about the game. I remember I was in the middle of telling a story about how my boss had been riding my ass all week when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just the sun reflecting off something metallic in the trees, but when I looked more carefully, I realized there were actual lights moving in circular patterns above the tree line behind Ryan's shed. "Hey, you guys see that?" I asked, pointing toward the weird lights. Ryan squinted, then nodded. "Yeah, what the hell is that? Like a drone or something?" Kelly leaned forward in her chair. "Maybe it's a helicopter, though it's not making any noise." The lights were unlike anything I'd seen before, not like aircraft lights or anything man-made. They moved with an intelligence, creating perfect circles above the trees, sometimes changing color from white to a bluish tint. We all commented on it, but weren't particularly alarmed. Curious, but not scared. Not yet, anyway. We kept watching the lights for maybe 2 minutes, trying to figure out what could be causing them, when something else caught my attention. There was an old wheelbarrow lying on its side about halfway up the slope toward the shed. I'd noticed it earlier when we first sat down. Ryan had been doing some landscaping work and hadn't put his tools away yet. Something moved behind that wheelbarrow. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or maybe a neighbor's cat, but then it crawled out into full view and my entire body went cold. "Holy shit," I whispered, pointing. Look at that." Ryan and Kelly both turned to look, and I heard Kelly's sharp intake of breath. The creature, and I don't know what else to call it, was crouched on all fours next to the wheelbarrow. When I pointed at it, it turned its head toward us, and I swear to God, it looked as surprised to see us as we were to see it. Our eyes locked for what felt like forever, but was probably only a couple of seconds. Its face was human. Too human. But the rest of its body was covered in this short golden tan hair. It had a body shape that looked like it could stand on 2 legs if it wanted to. Broad shoulders, muscular arms, and proportionally smaller legs. But there it was, on all fours, watching us watch it. No tail. That's something that stuck with me afterward. Whatever this thing was, it didn't have a tail. The moment broke when Kelly whispered, "What the fuck is that?" And the creature took off like someone had fired a starting pistol. It ran up the hill on all fours, but the way it moved wasn't like any animal I've ever seen. It sounded like a horse galloping. That's the only way I can describe it. This heavy, rhythmic pounding against the ground as it sprinted toward the shed. When it reached the shed, it leaped, and I mean leaped, clearing the entire structure in one bound and disappearing into the trees where the strange lights had been circling. The moment it vanished into the trees, the lights disappeared too. The 3 of us sat in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking as I put my beer down on the patio table. "Did you guys just see that?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan nodded, his face pale. "What the fuck was that thing?" Kelly was visibly trembling. "I don't know, but I think we should go inside right now." But Ryan, always the brave one, or stupid one, depending on how you look at it, stood up. We need to check it out. Whatever that was, it went into those trees. Are you insane? Kelly hissed. You want to go looking for that thing? I was torn. Part of me wanted to run inside, lock the door, and pretend none of this had happened. But another part, the part that couldn't believe what I'd just witnessed, needed to know more. I'll go with you, I told Ryan, surprising myself. Ryan went into his garage and came back with a shovel and a heavy-duty flashlight. I took the flashlight while he gripped the shovel like a weapon. Kelly refused to come with us, and I couldn't blame her. You guys are fucking crazy, she said, backing toward the sliding glass door that led into Ryan's house. I'm staying right here. Ryan and I started slowly walking up the slope toward the shed. The sun had dipped lower now, and shadows were stretching across the yard. Every step felt like walking through molasses. My legs were heavy with fear, but curiosity kept pushing me forward. We were about halfway to the shed when Kelly called out from the patio, "Oh my God, you guys, look up at the sky." We both turned around. Kelly was pointing up at the darkening sky above us. Did you see that shooting star? It was amazing. It went right over us. But there was something in her voice that didn't sound right, a forced enthusiasm that seemed out of place given what had just happened. And when I looked back at her, her expression didn't match her excited words. She looked terrified. That's when the real fear hit me. A shooting star right after what we'd seen. The timing was too perfect, too coincidental, and Kelly's strange reaction made me wonder if she'd seen something else entirely. Something she couldn't process or didn't want to acknowledge. "Ryan," I whispered, "I think we should go back." Ryan was staring at the trees beyond his fence, the shovel gripped so tightly in his hands that his knuckles had turned white. "Yeah," he agreed. "Yeah, let's go." We backed down the slope, never turning our backs to the trees until we reached the patio. Kelly was already inside, and we quickly followed, locking the sliding glass door behind us. We didn't go to Applebee's that night. We stayed at Ryan's place, sitting in his living room with all the lights on, barely speaking. When we did talk, it wasn't about what we'd seen. We talked about work, about the softball game, about anything else. It was like we'd all silently agreed not to discuss it. I stayed at Ryan's that night, too scared to drive home alone. Kelly called her roommate to say she was staying over too. None of us slept well. Every sound outside made me jump. A car passing by, the wind rustling the trees, a neighbor's dog barking in the distance. All I could think about was that creature's face looking back at me. Those eyes that seemed to recognize me as much as I recognized it as something that shouldn't exist. The next morning, in the harsh light of day, we still didn't talk about it. We made weak jokes about drinking too much, even though we'd each only had one beer before. It happened. We went our separate ways with awkward goodbyes and promises to text each other later. For almost a year, none of us mentioned that night. We still hung out, still played softball, still went to Applebee's after games. But there was this unspoken thing between us, this shared experience that we all pretended hadn't happened. It wasn't until the following summer that Ryan finally brought it up. We were at a bar, just the two of us. Kelly had moved to Portland for a job a few months earlier. "Do you ever think about that night?" Ryan asked suddenly, staring into his beer. I knew immediately what he was talking about. "All the time," I admitted. "What do you think it was?" he asked. I shook my head. "I don't know. I've looked online, tried to find something that matches what we saw. Nothing does." "Not exactly." "Bigfoot?" Ryan suggested, but he said it with a half smile, like he knew it wasn't quite right. "Maybe," I said, "but it wasn't like the pictures you see. It wasn't this giant hairy ape man. It was, I don't know, different." "And those lights," Ryan added. "What were they? And that shooting star Kelly saw?" We talked for hours that night, trying to make sense of what we'd witnessed. We never came to any conclusions. How could we? What we saw defied explanation. I've spent years researching cryptids, UFO sightings, paranormal phenomena, anything that might help me understand what happened that night. I've read countless stories from people who claim to have seen Bigfoot or had close encounters with something unexplainable in the woods. Some stories have elements that remind me of our experience, but none match it exactly. Sometimes I wonder if what we saw was something else entirely, something science hasn't discovered yet, or something so rare that few people ever encounter it. Or maybe, as some of the weirder theories suggest, something not from this world at all. All I know for certain is what I saw that night changed me. It showed me that the world is stranger than we can imagine, that there are things out there we can't explain, and sometimes those things are watching us as curiously as we're watching them. I still live in Washington State, though not in Federal Way anymore. Ryan moved away a few years after that night, and we've lost touch. Kelly and I exchange holiday cards, but we never talk about what happened. I don't blame them for wanting to forget, but I can't forget. Every time I'm near the woods, especially at dusk, when the light gets golden and shadows grow long, I find myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement, looking for lights, looking for answers I know I'll probably never find. Shade, Story 8. I've been hesitating to share this for years. Even now, typing this out, my hands are getting clammy. What happened that night in Florida has haunted me for so long, and I've only talked about it with the 5 other people who were there with me. We all saw the same thing, and none of us can explain it. This happened about 4 years ago. Me and 5 of my buddies decided to do an impromptu camping trip in this wooded area along one of those man-made canals in central Florida. The Army Corps of Engineers had been doing some digging work there for months, and there were these massive dirt piles everywhere. My buddy Tim knew about this spot because his uncle worked with the Corps, and he said it would be a cool place to camp since it was pretty secluded but still accessible by our vehicles. We arrived there around 6 in the evening. It was late spring, warm but not unbearably hot yet. The site was perfect, a decent-sized clearing surrounded by dense woods on 3 sides, with the canal and one of those enormous dirt piles on the 4th side. This wasn't just any little mound. This thing was like 3 stories high, with a steep, almost vertical face on our side. The Corps had obviously been moving earth around for their project, creating these unnatural hills and valleys in the landscape. We set up our 3 tents in a semicircle and got a fire going in the middle. Nothing fancy, just a basic campsite. We had some beers, grilled some burgers, told stupid stories. You know, regular camping stuff. It was actually really nice. The moon was bright enough that we could see most of the clearing without our flashlights, and the weather was perfect. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. 2 guys to each tent. I was sharing with my friend Kyle. I remember having trouble falling asleep because the ground was hard, and I could hear all kinds of weird noises from the woods. Not scary noises or anything, just the usual forest sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, that kind of stuff. But it kept me awake. I must have finally dozed off around 2 or 3 in the morning, because the next thing I remember is waking up needing to pee really badly. My phone said it was just after 4 a.m. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, trying not to wake Kyle, and stepped outside. The fire had died down to just embers, giving off a dim orange glow. The moon was still bright though, so I could see pretty well. I walked over to the edge of our camp, near where the woods started, to take a leak. That's when I got this weird feeling. You know that sensation when you just know something's watching you? It was like that, but 10 times stronger. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt cold all of a sudden, despite the warm night. I zipped up and turned around slowly, scanning the campsite and then the tree line across the clearing. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then something moved. On the opposite side of the clearing, right where the trees met the open space, something stepped out of the shadows. I froze. I literally couldn't move. What I was looking at didn't make any sense to my brain. It was a figure, standing upright like a man, but way too tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, and it was covered in what looked like dark, shaggy hair all over its body. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The arms hung down too low, the shoulders were too broad, and the head sat directly on those shoulders without much of a neck. I remember thinking, this can't be real. I'm dreaming. This is a nightmare. But I wasn't asleep. The cool night air on my skin, the smell of the dying campfire, the distant sound of frogs by the canal. It was all too vivid to be a dream. The thing just stood there at the edge of the clearing, completely still, watching our campsite. I could feel its eyes on us, even though I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance. I was too terrified to shout or wake the others. I just stood there, frozen, staring back at it. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds or so, I managed to take a single step backward toward the tents. That's when it moved. This is the part that still gives me nightmares. The creature suddenly bolted, not toward me, thank God, but toward the canal. It moved so fast, like nothing I've ever seen before. Not like a person running, more like, I don't know, like when you see a deer sprint through the woods, but bigger and more powerful. It reached the base of that massive dirt pile by the canal in seconds, and then, this is the part none of us can explain, it ran straight up the vertical face of the dirt pile, straight up without slowing down at all, like gravity just didn't apply to it. This wasn't a gentle slope. This was a near vertical wall of packed dirt, easily 3 stories high, and this thing ran up it like it was running on flat ground. No human could do that. Not even the best rock climbers in the world could sprint up a vertical surface like that. When it reached the top, it paused. Just for a moment. It turned and looked back, directly at me. I'm certain of it. Then it disappeared over the ridge and into the woods beyond. I finally unfroze and started yelling for everyone to wake up. I was screaming my head off, probably not making any sense. People started pouring out of their tents, confused and alarmed. What the hell, man? Kyle was rubbing his eyes. There was something out there. I was pointing wildly toward the dirt pile. Something big. It ran up that dirt wall like it was nothing. Of course, they thought I was crazy or playing a prank at first, but I must have looked genuinely terrified because they started taking me seriously pretty quickly. What did you see exactly? Asked Mike, who was always the level-headed one of our group. I tried to describe it, though my words were coming out all jumbled. As I was struggling to explain, Jason suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed. There it is again. And sure enough, there it was. The same figure, now standing at the top of the dirt pile, silhouetted against the night sky. Everyone saw it this time. All 6 of us, standing there in our pajamas and boxers, staring at this impossible thing. What the actual fuck is that? Whispered Ryan. Is that a person? Asked Kyle, but we all knew it wasn't a person. It was too big, too strange in its proportions, and no person could have run up that dirt wall the way I'd seen it do. As we watched, frozen in disbelief, the creature raised its arms over its head, making itself look even bigger. Then it made this sound, not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something in between. It echoed across the clearing and seemed to vibrate right through my chest. That was it for us. We didn't even discuss it. We all simultaneously decided we were getting the hell out of there. We started grabbing our stuff, throwing it haphazardly into our cars. We left the tent standing, abandoned the cooler, didn't even bother to properly put out the fire embers, just kicked dirt over them in a panic. The whole time we were packing up, I kept glancing at the top of the dirt pile, but the thing had disappeared again. That almost made it worse. Not knowing where it was now, we piled into our 2 cars and tore out of there, tires spinning in the dirt. Nobody spoke for the first 10 minutes of the drive. Then Kyle finally broke the silence. Did we all see the same thing? Because I need to know I'm not crazy. One by one, we described what we'd seen. The details matched. A huge, hairy, humanoid figure that moved with impossible speed and could run up vertical surfaces. Some kind of animal that shouldn't exist. We spent the rest of the night at a 24-hour Waffle House, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of what had happened. We came up with all kinds of explanations. A bear standing on its hind legs, but bears can't run up vertical walls. Someone in a costume playing a prank, but no human could move like that. Mass hallucination, but all 6 of us. By morning, we were exhausted and confused, but we'd reached an unspoken agreement not to talk about it with anyone else. Who would believe us anyway? The next day, 2 of the guys, Mike and Ryan, insisted on going back to get our abandoned gear. They said the creature was probably just a Florida black bear, that the moonlight and our fear had transformed into something more sinister in our minds. They took pictures of the dirt pile to prove to themselves that it was just an ordinary slope that only looked vertical in the dark. But the photos they brought back only confirmed what I already knew. That wall of dirt was nearly vertical, with barely any footholds. No human could have run up it. No bear either. I've researched everything I could think of since then. Local wildlife, escaped exotic pets, even mythology and cryptids. The closest thing I can find is Bigfoot or skunk ape sightings. But even those don't mention the ability to defy gravity like what we saw. I haven't been camping since that night. None of us have, at least not together. And whenever the subject comes up, we change it quickly. But I know none of us have forgotten. I still don't know what we saw in those Florida woods. All I know is that something impossible was watching us that night. Something that moved unlike anything that should exist in this world. And sometimes, when I wake up around 4 in the morning, I can't shake the feeling that it might be watching me still. Story 9. I've never been able to explain what we saw that day. I'm putting this out there because I just need to tell someone who might understand, or at least not immediately laugh it off. This happened back in the summer of '71, and I swear I still think about it at least once a week. Me and my 2 buddies, Jim and Ron, we'd been planning this hiking trip for months. We were all in our early 20s, working dead-end jobs in Denver, and needed to escape the city for a while. We'd saved up enough money to take a week off, bought all the gear we could afford, which wasn't much, and headed up to the Rawa Wilderness near Steamboat in Roosevelt National Forest. None of us were expert hikers by any means, but we'd done enough weekend trips to feel confident about a longer journey. The area was beautiful but remote, exactly what we wanted. This was before cell phones, GPS, or any of that. Just us, our backpacks, a couple of maps, and the mountains. We'd been hiking for 3 days when it happened. The weather had been perfect. Warm days, cool nights, not too much sun. We were making good progress, probably around 10,000 feet elevation, moving through these gorgeous alpine meadows, the kind of scenery that makes you feel small and insignificant, but in a good way, you know? It was around midday on the 4th day. We'd stopped for lunch near this little stream that cut through the meadow. The wildflowers were everywhere, blues and yellows and purples. The mountains rose up around us, still showing patches of snow near the peaks, despite it being July. After we ate, we decided to venture higher up, just to see what was over the next ridge. The meadow gradually gave way to rockier terrain as we climbed. There were these scattered patches of snow that had survived the summer heat, nestled in shady spots between rocks or in small depressions. Nothing unusual about that at this elevation. I was in the lead when I spotted the first footprint. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I stopped so suddenly that Jim bumped into my back. "What's up?" he asked. I just pointed. There, in a patch of snow about 15 feet across, was a line of footprints. 3 distinct impressions, cutting diagonally across the white surface. "Holy shit," Ron whispered as he came up beside us. The 3 of us moved closer, almost tiptoeing like we might scare away whatever had made the prints. Up close, they were even more bizarre. They were feet, human feet, except they weren't. They were massive. I wear a size 11 shoe. These prints had to be at least 16 or 17 inches long. The shape was unmistakably a bare human foot, 5 toes, a ball, an arch and a heel, but scaled up to a size that seemed impossible. Ron knelt down next to one of the prints. "Look at the detail," he said, his voice weirdly quiet, like we were in a church. "You can see the individual toes." He was right. The impressions were remarkably detailed. You could make out each toe, separated from the others, pushing into the snow. The ball of the foot created a deeper depression, and the arch curved exactly like a human foot would. The heel was clearly defined. These weren't just rough shapes. They looked like someone had pressed a perfectly formed giant foot into the snow. "Could be a bear," Jim suggested, but even he didn't sound convinced. "Bears don't have feet like this," Ron said. "Not with 5 toes and an arch. This is a human foot, just huge." I remember feeling a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Let's see where they go," I said. We followed the direction of the prints. They exited the snow patch and disappeared on the rocky ground. About 30 feet away was another snow patch, and there they were again. 2 more prints. Exactly the same. The stride length was incredible, easily 6 or 7 feet apart. I'm 6'1", and I tried to match the stride. I had to jump to reach from one print to the next, and even then, I barely made it. "This is crazy," Jim said. "No human could make a stride like that naturally." We kept following the trail. The pattern repeated itself across 5 or 6 snow patches scattered up the slope. Only in the snow. Nothing visible on the bare ground between patches. The prints were heading up toward a stand of pine trees near the ridge. "Maybe it's some kind of joke," Ron suggested. "Maybe someone's playing a prank with fake feet." I shook my head. "Out here, miles from the nearest trail, and how would you make fake feet that leave impressions this detailed?" I pointed to the clear toe marks. "Look at how the snow compresses differently around the toes and the ball of the foot. You can't fake that." We all stood there, staring at these impossible footprints, trying to make sense of them. I remember the silence that fell over us. Not just us being quiet, but the whole mountainside seemed to go still. No birds, no wind in the trees, nothing, just us and those prints. "What if?" Jim started, then stopped. "What if what?" I asked. "What if it's one of those things, you know, a Sasquatch or whatever?" In 1971, Bigfoot wasn't the cultural phenomenon it is now. The Patterson-Gimlin film was only a few years old, but we'd all heard stories, seen the occasional newspaper article. It was still mostly treated as a joke, something for the tabloids. "Don't be ridiculous," Ron said, but his voice lacked conviction. I walked over to the nearest print and crouched down. "Look at this," I said. "The edges are still sharp. These are fresh." That realization hit us all at once. Whatever had made these prints had been here very recently, possibly within the last hour or 2. "Could they be melted and refrozen?" Ron asked. "Maybe they were smaller prints that got bigger as the snow melted." I shook my head. "Then they'd be distorted. These are perfectly shaped, and look at the depth. They're pressed into the snow a good 2 inches. Whatever made these was heavy." We stood there debating what to do next. Part of me wanted to keep following the prints to see where they led. Another part, a more primitive part of my brain, was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. "I say we keep going," Jim said finally. "We may never get another chance like this." So we did. We followed the tracks up toward the tree line, finding more prints in each patch of snow we encountered. Always the same. Clear, detailed impressions of a giant, human-like foot with a stride length that defied explanation. As we got closer to the trees, I noticed the forest seemed darker than it should have been in midday. The pines were old and dense, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. I remember feeling a growing sense of unease, like we were being watched. "Maybe we should go back," Ron said suddenly, voicing what I was thinking. Jim looked disappointed but nodded. "Yeah, maybe you're right. That's when we heard it. It wasn't loud, just a crack, like a branch breaking somewhere in the trees ahead of us. We all froze. "Probably just a deer," Jim whispered. But it wasn't a deer. I've been hunting enough times to know what a deer sounds like moving through the woods. This was heavier, deliberate. There was another sound, a sort of low whooshing noise that I couldn't identify, then silence again. "Let's go," I said, no longer caring if I sounded scared. We turned and started making our way back down the slope, trying to move quickly without looking like we were running away. No one wanted to admit we were spooked, but we all were. We'd made it about halfway back to where we'd first seen the prints when Ron grabbed my arm. "Look," he hissed, about 100 yards away, at the edge of the tree line we'd been approaching. Something moved. I can't tell you exactly what it was. The distance was too great, and it was partially obscured by the trees. But it was big, much bigger than a person. It seemed to shift from one tree to another, just a dark shape against the darkness of the forest. "Jesus Christ," Jim whispered. We stood frozen, watching. The shape moved again, and this time I caught a glimpse of something dark brown or black, upright, moving with a strange fluidity for something so large. That was enough for us. Without another word, we turned and got out of there, no longer caring if we looked scared or foolish. We didn't run. The terrain was too treacherous for that. But we moved as fast as we safely could, putting distance between us and whatever was up there. We didn't stop until we reached our campsite, and we didn't talk much for the rest of the day. That night, huddled around our small fire, we finally discussed what we'd seen. "Could have been a bear," Jim suggested half-heartedly. "Standing upright? Moving like that?" Ron shook his head. "No way." "Those prints weren't bear prints," I added. "We all saw them. They were feet, human feet, just massive." We decided to cut our trip short. The next morning, we packed up and headed back towards civilization, taking a different route than we'd planned, avoiding the higher meadows altogether. None of us had cameras with us. This was before everyone carried phones that could take pictures. Sometimes, I wish we'd been able to document what we saw. Other times, I'm glad we couldn't. I'm not sure I want proof of what made those tracks. We talked about reporting what we'd seen when we got back, but to who? The Forest Service, the local newspaper? We knew how it would sound. 3 young guys out in the wilderness, claiming they saw Bigfoot tracks. We'd be laughed out of town, so we kept it to ourselves. Jim and Ron and I drifted apart over the years, the way friends do. Last I heard, Jim was living in Seattle, and Ron passed away a few years back. As far as I know, none of us ever went back to that specific area of Roosevelt National Forest. I've been a skeptic my whole life. I don't believe in ghosts or aliens or monsters, but those footprints in the snow, the perfect detail, the impossible stride length, the way they only appeared in the snow patches. I've never been able to explain them. And that shape we saw at the tree line, moving with such strange grace for something so large. I still go hiking occasionally, though never alone, and I always find myself scanning the trees, looking at the ground for tracks, listening a little too intently to the sounds of the forest, wondering if someday I'll see those prints again, and wondering what I'll do if I do. So that's my story. Take it for what it's worth. I know what we saw that day in 1971. I just don't know what it was. Story 10. I've been meaning to share this for a long time, but it's not easy to talk about what happened. It's hard to admit you've seen something most people don't believe in, especially when you can't explain it yourself. What I witnessed back in the fall of '88 near Decatur, Louisiana, has stayed with me for decades now. I was 32 then. Experienced in the outdoors, knew the difference between a bear and other wildlife. This was something else entirely. That particular Saturday in October was perfect fishing weather. Cool, but not cold. Overcast, but not threatening rain. I'd taken my dad's old Chevy pickup down to a spot on the river I'd visited a few times before. Not many people knew about it, which was exactly why I liked it. The path from the dirt parking area to the water was about a half-mile hike through fairly dense woods. I noticed something odd almost immediately after starting down the trail. There were these stacks of flat rocks balanced on top of each other, not natural formations, but clearly placed there deliberately. At first I figured some kids had been messing around, but then I saw more of them, spaced out every 50 yards or so. What was stranger were these broken branches twisted together about 10 feet up in the trees, forming these perfect triangular shapes, again, definitely not natural. I remember thinking it might be some kind of trail marking system used by the Forestry Service, though I'd never seen anything like it before. The weird markers continued all the way to the water, but fishing was on my mind, so I didn't give them much more thought. I had my favorite rod, my tackle box, and a small cooler with a couple sandwiches and beers. Perfect setup for a few peaceful hours by the water. The spot was a wider section of the river with a gentle current. The opposite bank was maybe 70 yards away, rising up into a wooded hill. I found my usual spot, a fallen log that made a perfect seat, and settled in. The fishing was decent that day. I'd caught 2 decent-sized bass in the first hour and was just enjoying being away from everything. No other fishermen, no cars, nothing but the sounds of the water and occasional bird calls. It must have been around 2 in the afternoon when I first noticed something odd on the opposite bank. Just a movement that caught my eye. At first I thought it might be a deer coming down to drink, but the movement pattern was wrong. I had my binoculars in my pack, so I pulled them out for a better look. What I saw through those lenses froze me in place. It wasn't a deer, it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before or could have imagined. About halfway up the opposite bank, moving between trees, was a creature walking on 2 legs, not hunched over like a bear sometimes does, but fully upright, moving with purpose. My first thought was, that's a person in a suit, but that made no sense out here, and as I watched longer, I knew no human could move like that or have that build. This thing was massive. I'd estimate at least 9 feet tall, not fat but solid, like a bodybuilder, probably over 400 pounds. It was covered in hair, predominantly black but with these streaks of white-grey mixed in, especially around what I'd call its shoulders. The hair wasn't super long, maybe 6 to 8 inches, and it moved naturally with the creature's motion, not like a costume. I kept watching, barely breathing, as it moved along the opposite bank. It was using a large branch like a walking stick, which struck me as bizarrely intelligent. It would stop occasionally, flip over rocks with its free hand, and seem to inspect whatever was underneath. I couldn't tell if it was looking for food or something else. My hands were shaking so badly I had to brace the binoculars against a tree to keep them steady. That's when I got a clear look at its face, and that's what has haunted me ever since. Its face wasn't fully ape-like, but it definitely wasn't human either. There was this prominent brow ridge, though not as pronounced as you'd see on a gorilla. The skin on its face was a light greyish colour, with sparse hair, not the full face coverage you'd expect from an ape. What really struck me was the nose. It was prominent but not fully developed, more substantial than an ape's, but not quite human either. The eyes were what really got to me. They were this amber colour, almost yellowish brown, and they had this awareness to them, not animal awareness, but something else. They scanned the environment methodically, like it was searching for something specific. I could see its teeth when it opened its mouth once, straight front teeth but with canines that reminded me of my neighbour's German shepherd. Those canines were long, maybe an inch or inch and a half. The head shape was strange too, kind of like a water balloon with a pointed top. Not a cone exactly, but definitely not round like a human head. All this time I was crouched behind my fallen log, barely moving, barely breathing. I'd completely forgotten about my fishing rod, which was propped up nearby. The creature continued its methodical movement along the bank, still using that branch like a tool, still examining rocks and occasionally looking into the water. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. It stopped, straightened up to its full height and seemed to sniff the air. Then it turned its head and looked directly toward me. I don't think it could have seen me clearly from that distance, even with whatever vision capabilities it had, but it knew something was there. It knew I was there. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like forever but was probably only 30 seconds, it seemed to lose interest and continued its movement along the bank. What happened next made me question everything I thought I knew about wildlife. The creature approached the edge of the river at a narrower point, tested the water with its branch, and then, with deliberate, careful movements, began to wade across. The water at that point must have been chest deep on a normal person, which meant it was probably waist deep on this thing. It moved through the water with powerful, efficient strides, still holding that branch, using it to test the depth ahead of it. There was a deliberateness to its movements that was unsettling. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. This was something planning and executing those plans. I realized it was crossing to my side of the river, maybe 100 yards downstream from my position. I should have run then. Every instinct was screaming at me to grab my stuff and get the hell out of there, but I was paralyzed, not just by fear, but by a kind of awe. I was seeing something that shouldn't exist, something that defied everything I understood about the natural world. The creature reached my side of the river, shook itself briefly like a dog would, and then continued into the woods, disappearing from my view. That finally broke my trance. I grabbed my fishing rod, knocked over my tackle box in my panic, left it where it fell, and moved as quickly and quietly as I could back toward the trail. I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified I'd see that thing emerging from the trees behind me. I tried to move quietly, but my heart was pounding so hard I was sure anything within a mile could hear it. When I reached the trail, I noticed those strange rock stacks again. And suddenly, they took on a whole new meaning. These weren't random. They weren't made by kids or forest rangers. These were markers of some kind, possibly made by that creature or others like it. I practically ran the rest of the way to my truck, fumbled with the keys, and got the hell out of there. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely drive. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing following me down the road. When I got back to town, I drove straight to the ranger station. The guy on duty could tell something had happened. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told him everything, trying to be as detailed and clear as possible. He took notes, asked a few questions, seemed to take me seriously enough. He said they'd look into it, but I could tell he was just humoring me. He probably thought I was drunk or hallucinating or just another crazy person seeing Bigfoot in the woods. I never heard anything back from them. I called a few times in the following weeks, but they always said the same thing. They'd found nothing unusual in the area. Eventually, I stopped calling. I went back once, about a month later, in the middle of the day, with a friend who thought I was overreacting. We didn't see the creature, but the rock stacks were still there, and some of them had been rearranged. My friend tried to tell me it was just people messing around, but I know what I saw. I've never told many people about this. Who would believe me? I can barely believe it myself sometimes. But I know what I saw that day. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a suit. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist according to science, but was very much real. That day changed me. I still go fishing, still spend time outdoors, but never alone anymore, and never in that spot. Sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there, still flipping rocks and using tools, still marking its territory with those strange symbols. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 11. I still can't believe it's been almost 60 years since it happened. July 1966. The memory is so clear in my mind, I could have sworn it happened last week. I was 23 then, living in a small house near Elfers, right by the Anclote River in Pasco County, Florida. Back then, that area was nothing like it is now. Mostly untouched wilderness with thick pine forests, sprawling oak trees, and swampy stretches that stretched for miles. I knew those woods like the back of my hand. Walking them was my escape, my way of clearing my head after long shifts at the paper mill. I'd spend hours out there, learning every trail, every landmark. I thought I knew everything those woods had to offer. I was wrong. So wrong. It was a scorching day, even by Florida standards, the kind of heat where your shirt sticks to your back the moment you step outside. I remember the cicadas were deafening that summer, their constant buzz filling the air as I made my way down my usual path through the dense tree line. The ground was soft beneath my boots from a thunderstorm the night before, making that familiar squelching sound with each step. I'd been walking for maybe 45 minutes when something made me stop. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a feeling. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming sense that I was being watched. The woods had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just heavy silence. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, partially hidden among a cluster of cypress trees, was what I initially thought was a man, just standing there, perfectly still. My first thought was that it might be another hunter or maybe someone trespassing on private property. I raised my hand to wave, but the gesture froze halfway. As my eyes adjusted to the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, I realized that whatever was standing there was much, much too large to be human. The figure was broad, impossibly broad, with shoulders that seemed to span the width of a doorway, and tall. God, it was tall. At least 7 feet, maybe 8. I couldn't make out details from that distance, just a massive silhouette, dark against the trees. But I could tell it was watching me just as intently as I was watching it. Then it made a sound that turned my blood to ice, a harsh, guttural coughing noise, nothing like I'd ever heard from any human or animal in those woods. It was deep and resonant, almost like it was clearing its throat, but with an unnatural quality that made my skin crawl. The sound echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere at once. I froze completely, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear standing on its hind legs. No, the proportions were all wrong. Some kind of elaborate prank. Out here, miles from anywhere, impossible. The thing shifted slightly, moving one massive arm to grasp a tree trunk. The movement was fluid, deliberate, intelligent. That's when the reality hit me. I was looking at something that shouldn't exist, something I'd only heard about in stories from the Pacific Northwest. Not here, not in Florida. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, slowly and deliberately, it turned and moved deeper into the trees. Not running, not frightened, just calmly walking away. The ground actually trembled slightly with each footfall. I could hear branches snapping under its weight. Only when it disappeared from view did my survival instinct finally kick in. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked, not ran, because something deep inside told me running would be a terrible idea, back the way I came. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, hands shaking so badly I couldn't even light a cigarette. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation, but I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I had to go back. This time, I wasn't going unprepared. I grabbed my Remington rifle, not that I planned to shoot anything, but having it made me feel safer. Then I called my buddy Ray, who lived nearby. Ray had been a Marine and wasn't the type to scare easily. When I told him what I'd seen, he didn't laugh or call me crazy like I'd expected. Instead, he got real quiet, then said, "I'll be there in 15 minutes." True to his word, Ray pulled up in his old pickup exactly 15 minutes later. He had his own rifle and a camera, smart thinking, something I'd been too shaken to consider. "You really think we're gonna find your monkey man?" he asked as we headed back toward the woods. There was a nervous edge to his joking tone that told me he was taking this more seriously than he let on. "I don't know what we're gonna find," I replied honestly, "but I know what I saw." We reached the spot where I'd had my encounter about an hour later. The figure was gone, of course, but there was something else that made Ray stop dead in his tracks. A smell, a vile, overwhelming odor that hit us like a physical force. It was like rancid garbage mixed with stale urine and something else I couldn't identify, something musky and wild. The stench was so potent we both had to pull our shirts up over our noses. Jesus Christ, Ray gagged. What the hell died out here? But it wasn't the smell of death. It was the smell of something alive. Something that had been standing right where we were now. That's when Ray spotted them, the footprints. They were pressed deep into the soft earth, clearly made by something heavy, and they were huge, easily 17 inches long and 6 inches wide. They weren't bear tracks or deer tracks or anything else I recognized. They were footprints, human-like footprints, but impossibly large, with 5 distinct toe impressions, and they were fresh. Most convincingly, they were in a walking pattern, left, right, made by something walking upright on 2 legs. This ain't right, Ray muttered, crouching down to examine one of the prints more closely. This is a damn joke, right? Someone's messing with you. I shook my head. Look at how deep they are. Whatever made these weighs hundreds of pounds. We followed the tracks, which led deeper into the woods, toward the river. The smell got stronger as we went. Ray took some photos of the clearest footprints. His hands were steady, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way he kept scanning the trees around us. After tracking the prints for about a quarter mile, I decided we needed to call the sheriff. This was beyond us now. Ray agreed immediately, which told me how rattled he really was. We hiked back out to where we had reception, and I made the call. I was surprised when they said they'd send someone out right away. I guess they didn't get many calls about giant footprints in the woods. 2 officers showed up about 40 minutes later. One was older, nearing retirement, named Deputy Collins. The other was younger, maybe 30, Officer Jenkins. They looked skeptical as we led them back to the footprints, but their attitudes changed when they got a whiff of that smell. "Good God," Jenkins said, his face screwing up in disgust. "You weren't kidding about the odor." Collins, who'd been a deputy for almost 30 years, looked genuinely puzzled. "Never smelled anything like this, not even when we find bodies in the swamp." They examined the footprints with growing concern. Collins took measurements and notes, while Jenkins took more photos. They followed the tracks with us toward the river, asking questions about what exactly I'd seen. I described the figure as best I could: the height, the broad shoulders, the dark color, though I couldn't tell if it was fur or skin from that distance, and the strange coughing sound it had made. The more I talked, the more uneasy the officers became. "You own hunting dogs, don't you?" Collins asked suddenly. I nodded. 3 blue-tick hounds, best trackers in the county. "Mind if we use them? See if they can pick up a scent?" An hour later I was back with my dogs, Buddy, Blue and Sadie. They were champion hunters who'd tracked everything from deer to wild boar through these woods. Nothing had ever stopped them once they got on a trail, until now. The moment they caught that strange scent, their behavior changed completely. Blue, the alpha of the pack, tucked his tail between his legs and whined. Buddy paced nervously, refusing to move toward the trail. Sadie, usually the bravest, actually tried to pull away from her leash, desperate to go in the opposite direction. I'd never seen them act like this. Never. These dogs would chase a wounded bear without hesitation, but whatever scent they were picking up now terrified them. We coaxed and commanded, but they absolutely refused to follow the trail toward the river. It was like trying to drag them toward a fire. Their instinct for self-preservation was overriding years of training. Finally giving up on the dogs, the 4 of us continued following the tracks ourselves. They led straight to the riverbank, where we found something that still haunts me to this day. At the muddy edge of the Anclote River were handprints, not human handprints. These were massive, with 4 distinct finger-like impressions, but no thumbprint. The fingers were long and deeply pressed into the soft mud, as if whatever had made them had pushed off to enter the water. We all stood there, staring at those impossible handprints. No one spoke for a long time. What could we say? This defied explanation. "I'm not sure how to file this report," Jenkins finally said, his voice unnaturally quiet. Collins just shook his head, looking older than he had an hour before. "I've been patrolling these woods for 3 decades, never seen anything like this, never heard stories about anything like this." "So what do we do?" Ray asked. No one had an answer. The officers took more photos and measurements, but I could tell they were going through the motions. They knew, as we all did, that nothing would come of this. No investigation, no answers. Just an unfiled report and some photographs that would probably disappear into some drawer. As the sun started to set, we made our way back, mostly in silence. The woods felt different now. No longer familiar territory, but something alien and unpredictable. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced we were being watched from the trees. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside my window made me tense up. The dogs wouldn't settle either, pacing and whining until dawn. I never walked those woods alone again. Ray and I went back a few times with rifles, but we never saw the creature again. The footprints were gone too, washed away by rain or time. The officers never followed up, and when I called the station a week later, they said the photos hadn't developed properly. Convenient. I've spent nearly 6 decades wondering about what I saw that day, reading everything I could find about similar sightings. Most were from Washington, Oregon, Northern California, the Pacific Northwest. But over the years, I've connected with others who've had encounters in unexpected places: Florida, Louisiana, Texas, Ohio. These creatures aren't confined to one region. They're everywhere, hiding in the disappearing wild places, watching us, avoiding us most of the time. I'm an old man now, and those woods have mostly been cleared for housing developments. The world has changed, become smaller, more connected. But I know there are still secrets out there. Things science can't explain. Things most people wouldn't believe. I believe, though. I have to. I know what I saw that scorching July day in 1966. And sometimes, on humid summer nights when the cicadas are loud and the air hangs heavy, I swear I can still catch a whiff of that awful smell carried on the breeze from whatever wilderness is left. Story 12. So I grew up in this small town in western Pennsylvania. Not much to do around here except drink beer in someone's basement or hang out in the woods. I've been fishing since I was a kid. My grandpa taught me. This reservoir about 3 miles from my house has always been my go-to spot. Nothing fancy, just a man-made lake with a concrete dam on one end. The county stocked it with trout every spring, but the catfish were what I was after that night. That evening started like any other. I finished my shift at the auto parts store around 9, grabbed some dinner and decided to head out for some night fishing. The reservoir is technically closed after sunset, but nobody enforces it. Local cops have better things to do than chase off fishermen, and I've been going there after hours for years without issues. I packed up my tackle box, grabbed my rod, a small cooler with a few beers and sandwiches, and my headlamp. The weather was perfect. Late May, maybe 60 degrees, slight breeze. I parked my car in the small gravel lot near the road. From there, you walk down this dirt path about 50 yards to reach the dam. I set up on the concrete spillway around 10:30. It's my favorite spot because you can cast into deeper water where the bigger catfish hang out. The concrete platform gives you a good level place to sit, and there's this metal railing you can lean against. I had my small tackle box, a 5-gallon bucket turned upside down as a seat, and my cooler beside me. Night fishing at this spot is incredibly peaceful. You can see the town lights reflecting off the water, hear the occasional splash of fish, frogs calling to each other. The woods around the reservoir are pretty dense, so it feels like you're miles from civilization, even though the nearest house is probably only half a mile away. I caught a few smaller fish early on, nothing worth keeping. Just enjoying being out there, having a beer, watching the stars. I had my headlamp off most of the time to preserve the battery, and because my eyes had adjusted to the darkness, the moon was about half full, giving just enough light to see the shoreline and my immediate surroundings. It must have been around 1 in the morning when things changed. I remember checking my phone to see if my buddy had texted me back about our plans for the weekend. 1:04 to be exact. I remember because I was thinking I should pack up soon since I had work at 9 the next morning. That's when I heard it. Footsteps coming up the dirt road that connects the parking area to the dam. At first, I thought maybe it was another night fisherman or even a park ranger, though I'd never seen one out this late. But something felt off right away. The steps were heavy, deliberate, and spaced further apart than a normal person's stride. The sound was coming from about 30 to 35 yards away, near where the road curves around some trees before reaching the dam. I couldn't see anything yet because of those trees, but I could definitely hear something big walking on that dirt path. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight, not my headlamp, but the heavy mag light I keep with my fishing gear, partly for the light, but if I'm being honest, partly because it could double as a weapon if needed. The footsteps continued, steady and heavy, and I pointed my light toward the sound. What happened next is something I'll never forget, no matter how much I try. My beam caught a pair of eyes reflecting back at me. Not the dull red you get from deer or raccoons, but this eerie greenish-yellow glow. They were set high off the ground, way higher than any animal around here should be. As the beam settled, I could make out a figure standing there on the path. I froze completely. Couldn't move, couldn't yell, couldn't do anything but stare. This thing was huge. I'm 6 foot tall, and this was easily 7 feet or more. It was covered in what looked like dark brown hair or fur, not like a bear's coat, but longer, shaggier. Based on its size and build, I'm guessing it weighed at least 400 pounds, maybe more. When my flashlight beam fully hit its face, I got just a glimpse of features that seemed almost human, but wrong. The face was flat with a pronounced brow, nothing like a bear's snout. Its shoulders were massive, probably twice the width of mine, and its arms hung down longer than a human's would. Here's the thing that really gets me. When my light hit it, it didn't run or charge or make any aggressive move. It just briefly turned its head toward me, almost like it was acknowledging my presence, but it didn't stop walking or change its pace at all. It just continued on its path, moving with this fluid, purposeful stride. Then it stepped off the road and into the woods near where my car was parked. I sat there paralyzed for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. My heart was hammering so hard, I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped my flashlight, and it clattered on the concrete. That sound snapped me out of it. I started frantically gathering my gear, trying to keep an eye on the woods where the thing had disappeared. I didn't bother properly packing anything. Just threw my tackle box shut, grabbed my rod and cooler, and left the bucket behind. I wasn't about to walk up that same path it had taken, so I scrambled up the embankment on the opposite side, scraping my hands on thorns and nearly twisting my ankle on loose rocks. I circled all the way around to the parking area, staying as far from the woods as I could. When I finally reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, despite the cool night. I threw everything in the trunk, jumped in and locked the doors immediately. The whole time I was fumbling with my keys, I kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see those eyes again. I finally got the engine started and peeled out of there, gravel flying. Didn't even bother with headlights until I hit the main road. I drove home with my heart still racing, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. When I got home, I sat in my driveway with the engine running for a while, trying to process what I'd seen. I couldn't. Still can't, really. I've tried to rationalize it since then. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs. But I've seen plenty of bears while hunting and they don't move like that. This thing walked with purpose, like a person would. Bears on their hind legs shuffle and wobble. And the eyes. Bear eyes don't reflect light like that. Could it have been a person in a costume? Out in the middle of nowhere, at 1 in the morning, just strolling through the woods? And who could make a costume that massive and realistic, with eyes that reflected light that way? Besides, who would go to all that trouble just to walk past a random fisherman and not even try to scare them? The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I kept replaying it in my mind, questioning if I really saw what I thought I saw. By afternoon, curiosity got the better of me, and I drove back to the reservoir in broad daylight. My bucket was still there on the dam. I looked for tracks on the dirt path, but couldn't find anything definitive, just some disturbed areas that could have been from anything. I went to the library that weekend and started researching. That's when I came across accounts of Bigfoot sightings in our region. I'd always laughed at that stuff before, thought it was just stories made up by attention seekers or people who'd had too much to drink. I'm not laughing anymore. The descriptions matched what I saw, the height, the build, the way it moved, even the eye shine. I found reports from the 70s about sightings near the same reservoir. One account from 1987 described an encounter almost identical to mine. A fisherman, alone at night, watching this creature simply walk past without aggression. I haven't gone fishing alone after dark since then, not just at the reservoir, but anywhere. I've tried to convince friends to come with me, but I can't bring myself to tell them why I suddenly need company. They'd think I was nuts. Sometimes I drive past the reservoir during the day and look out at the water, wondering if it's still out there in those woods, wondering if it watches people come and go, wondering if it's always been there and I just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time to see it. The thing that haunts me most isn't fear that it might have hurt me, it's the complete lack of interest it showed. Like I was so insignificant, it didn't even need to acknowledge me beyond that brief glance. Like it was just passing through a space that belonged more to it than to me. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if I'll ever understand it, but I know it was real. And I know I'm not going back there alone in the dark. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen. And some spaces, I've learned, aren't really ours at all. Story 13. I've never shared this publicly before, but I need to get it off my chest. It's been weighing on me for 50 years now. What happened that night in Pennsylvania still gives me cold sweats, and I've never found an explanation that makes sense. It was August 27th, 1973. The kind of hot, sticky evening where you can feel your shirt clinging to your back. My partner and I were sitting out on our back porch, trying to catch whatever breeze we could. We lived in a fairly remote area near the mountains, with our nearest neighbor about half a mile down the road. The cicadas were making their usual racket, and we were just talking about mundane things, bills, plans for the weekend, whether we needed to fix the back steps before winter. Around 9:30 or so, the cicadas suddenly went quiet. It was like someone had flipped a switch. You know that feeling when the air pressure changes right before a storm? It felt like that. But there wasn't a cloud in the sky. I noticed it first. Above the tree line, maybe 100 yards away, there was this craft. I don't know what else to call it. It was shaped like a boomerang, but bigger than anything I'd ever seen in the sky before. I'd guess it was at least the size of a small commercial airplane, but it wasn't making any noise, not a single sound. "Do you see that?" I whispered, grabbing my partner's arm. The thing had these bright blue lights underneath it, not flashing like normal aircraft lights, but a steady, intense blue that reminded me of those high-powered welding torches. The lights were casting this eerie blue glow on the tops of the pine trees below. We both froze, just watching this thing hover there. It was moving, but so slowly it was barely perceptible. I remember thinking it couldn't be a plane because planes don't just hang in the air like that, and helicopters make noise, lots of it. We sat there for maybe 2 minutes just staring. Then, without warning, the craft shot forward. I don't mean it accelerated gradually. It went from practically stationary to what must have been hundreds of miles per hour in less than a second. It zipped across the valley toward Beach Hill on the other side, and then it just dropped below the tree line, like it had fallen out of the sky, except it seemed controlled. The whole forest on that side lit up with that blue glow for a few seconds, and then it dimmed down to just a faint illumination among the trees. My partner immediately stood up. "I'm going to check it out," he said, already heading inside. "Are you crazy?" I asked, but I knew there was no stopping him when he got that determined look. He came back out with a flashlight in one hand and his shotgun in the other. I begged him not to go, but he insisted. It might be a plane crash. What if someone needs help? I couldn't argue with that logic, even though every instinct I had was screaming that this wasn't a normal aircraft situation. There was something unnatural about the way it moved, the silence, those blue lights. "I'll be back in 20 minutes, he promised. "If I'm not, call Sheriff Benson." I nodded and watched him head down our property toward the tree line. The moon was nearly full that night, so I could see him pretty clearly until he entered the woods. Then, his flashlight beam was the only thing visible, bobbing between the trees as he headed toward Beach Hill. I went inside, pacing around the kitchen, keeping my eyes on the window that faced the direction he'd gone. I considered calling someone right then, but who would believe me? "Hi." We saw a silent flying boomerang with blue lights. They'd think I was crazy or drunk. From the kitchen window, I could see his flashlight beam getting closer to where the craft had gone down. The strange blue glow was still visible through the trees, but fainter now. I pressed my face against the glass, straining to see better. Then I saw his flashlight stop moving. It was pointed at something on the ground, and then it jerked upward suddenly, like he'd been startled. The beam was illuminating something tall, at least 6 feet, standing between 2 pine trees. Even from that distance, I could tell it wasn't human. The proportions were all wrong. The head was too large, the shoulders too wide, the arms too long. It looked like it was covered in dark hair or fur, but the worst part was the face. I couldn't make out details at that distance, but it looked dog-like with a snout instead of a normal human face. And the eyes, God, the eyes. They caught the flashlight beam and reflected it back. 2 small pitch-black orbs that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. For what felt like an eternity, neither my partner nor the creature moved. They were frozen in some kind of standoff. Then I heard the shotgun blast. Even from that distance, it was unmistakable. The creature ducked or dropped out of view. The flashlight beam started moving again, faster this time, heading back toward our house. I could tell my partner was running full tilt. I unlocked the back door just as he burst out of the tree line, sprinting across our yard like the devil himself was on his heels. When he reached the porch, he practically knocked the door off its hinges getting inside. I slammed it shut behind him and locked it. His face was ashen, and he was breathing so hard, I thought he might pass out. He propped the shotgun against the wall and slumped into a chair at the kitchen table. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What was that thing?" He shook his head, still trying to catch his breath. "Don't know," he finally managed to say. "Not human, not a bear, not anything I've ever seen before." "Did you hit it when you fired?" "No," he said. "Just fired to scare it off. It dropped down when I shot, then I ran. Didn't look back." "What about the craft? Did you see it up close?" He shook his head again. "Never got that far. That thing was between me and where I saw the blue lights, but the glow was still there in the trees behind it." We sat in the kitchen with all the lights on until sunrise, jumping at every creak and groan of our old house settling. My partner kept the shotgun within arm's reach, reloaded with fresh shells. We debated calling the sheriff a dozen times, but always came back to the same conclusion. No one would believe us. They'd think we were making it up or hallucinating. When dawn finally came, my partner wanted to go back and look for tracks or other evidence. I refused to let him go alone, and I sure as hell wasn't going myself, so we compromised and waited until full daylight. Around 8 in the morning, we both went, armed with the shotgun and a camera. We found the spot where he'd encountered the creature. The ground was hard and covered with pine needles, so there weren't any clear footprints, but several branches were broken about 7 feet off the ground, higher than either of us could reach, and there was a strange, musky odor lingering in the area, like wet dog mixed with something chemical I couldn't identify. As for the blue lights or the craft, there was no sign. No broken trees, no disturbed earth, no pieces of metal or anything else that would indicate something had landed or crashed there. It was as if it had never existed. Over the next few weeks, we scanned the local newspapers for any reports of strange sightings, but there was nothing. We asked our neighbors if they'd seen or heard anything unusual that night, being careful not to share too many details, but no one had. The only thing that kept me from thinking we'd both hallucinated the whole thing was a brief article I found in the paper about 2 weeks later. A farmer, about 15 miles from us, reported that several of his livestock had been found dead with unexplained injuries. The article didn't go into detail, and it was buried on page 12. But it made me wonder. We never saw the craft again. We never saw the creature again either. Though for months afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I was outside after dark. My partner started having nightmares about those black eyes, waking up in a cold sweat. We eventually moved away from that house the following year. Neither of us ever felt comfortable there again. To this day, I can't look up at the night sky without half expecting to see that silent boomerang shape and those blue lights. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I catch myself listening for footsteps and scanning the trees for reflective eyes. I don't know what we saw that night. Some kind of experimental aircraft and a bear standing on its hind legs? A hallucination brought on by something in the water, or something else entirely, something not from here? All I know is that I can still picture those small black eyes reflecting in the flashlight beam and the way that blue glow looked against the treetops. And whenever I think about it, I get the same cold feeling in the pit of my stomach that I had that night, watching from the kitchen window as something impossible stared back at my partner from the darkness of the Pennsylvania woods. Story 14. I've never told anyone about what happened that day. I'm not even sure I want to now, but I can't get it out of my head lately. It's been over 45 years, and I still wake up sometimes thinking about it. It was December of '76, 3 days after Christmas. I remember because I'd gotten a new helmet for my dirt bike, a bright red bell with a visor. I was 17 and had been saving up for months to upgrade my old Yamaha 125. Not the fanciest bike, but it was mine, and I loved that thing like nothing else. The weather that day was weird. Cold, obviously, being December in Cook County, but not the bitter cold you'd expect. Maybe mid-30s, just warm enough that the Red River wasn't completely frozen. There was patchy snow on the ground, and the sky had that flat grey look that makes everything seem muted and quieter than it should be. I told my parents I was going to meet up with some friends, but truth is, I just wanted to ride. The old toll bridge was a spot I'd go to when I needed to think or just be alone. The bridge hadn't been used for cars in years, but you could still walk across it or take a dirt bike if you were careful about the rotted planks. I remember the sound of my bike echoing off the trees as I rode the trail down to the river. The engine noise always seemed louder in winter with the leaves gone and everything so still. The trail was muddy and half frozen, that annoying in-between state where your tires slip 1 second and grip hard the next. I parked about 20 yards from the bridge and walked the rest of the way. The old structure creaked even under just my weight. I went about halfway across and leaned on the railing, watching the river below. The water was moving fast, carrying chunks of ice downstream. Some were tiny, just slivers really, but others were the size of coffee tables, spinning slowly as they drifted along. I'd been there maybe 15 minutes when I first heard the dogs. If you've never heard coon dogs on a trail, it's not something you forget. It's this deep, throaty howl that carries forever, especially across water. They were on the Oklahoma side of the river, probably a good quarter-mile upstream from where I stood. At first, I didn't think much of it. People hunted raccoons all the time around there, but something about the way those dogs were bawling made me pay attention. It wasn't the excited yapping of dogs that are having fun. This was more urgent, more intense. Made the hair on my arms stand up under my jacket. I turned to look upstream, trying to spot the dogs through the bare winter trees. The Oklahoma side of the bank had more vegetation than our side. Lots of brush and fallen timber, perfect raccoon territory. I figured I might catch a glimpse of the hunters too, maybe see if they got their coon. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Through the trees, maybe 150 yards away, something big was moving, and I mean big. My brain first tried to make it a person, then a bear, but neither fit what I was seeing. It was dark, not black, but a deep brown color that almost blended with the winter brush. And it was covered in hair, not fur like a bear, but longer, shaggier hair that moved as it ran, because it was running on two legs, upright. I remember my breath catching in my throat. The thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It was hard to judge at that distance, but it was definitely bigger than any man I'd ever seen, and the way it moved, God, the way it moved. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you'd expect something that size to be. It was fluid, powerful, each stride covering ground like an Olympic sprinter, but with none of the strain or effort. The dogs were closer to it now, maybe 30 yards behind. 2 of them, from what I could see, racing through the underbrush, still bawling their heads off. They were good-sized hunting dogs, probably blue ticks or red bones. The creature reached a fallen tree, a decent-sized one too, maybe 3 feet high where it had broken. Without breaking stride, this thing just leaped over it. Not a hurdle like a human would do, more like it just extended its stride and was suddenly on the other side, effortless. The first dog reached the log seconds later. It tried to jump over like the creature had done, but it wasn't as graceful. I heard a sharp yelp, the kind a dog makes when it's suddenly hurt bad. I couldn't see exactly what happened, but that dog never made another sound. The second dog cleared the log just fine, but as soon as it landed on the other side, it stopped dead in its tracks. I swear I could see it from where I stood, looking ahead at where the creature had gone, then back at its buddy. Then it just turned around and took off in the opposite direction, tail tucked between its legs. Not running like it was chasing something anymore, running like it was being chased. I stood frozen on that bridge for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I kept waiting to hear voices, to see the hunters come through the trees looking for their dogs, but there was nothing, just silence. That's what got me the most, how suddenly quiet everything had become. Even the river seemed hushed. No birds, no rustling in the trees, nothing, just dead quiet. I don't really remember making the decision to leave. 1 second I was standing there, gripping the bridge railing so tight my knuckles hurt, and the next I was walking backward, keeping my eyes fixed on that spot where the creature had disappeared. I was afraid to turn my back to it, even with the river between us. When my heel hit something solid, the end of the bridge, I finally turned and ran to my bike. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped my keys twice before I could get the bike started. The engine roared to life, way too loud in that unnatural silence, and I took off up the trail like the devil himself was after me. The whole ride home, I kept looking in my mirrors, convinced I'd see that thing following me. The rational part of my brain knew it couldn't have crossed the river that fast, but fear isn't rational. Every shadow in the trees looked like it might be moving. Every sound over my engine made me twist the throttle harder. I got home and parked my bike in the garage. My dad asked why I was back so early, and I mumbled something about the cold. I spent the rest of the day in my room trying to make sense of what I'd seen, trying to convince myself it had been a bear or a guy in a coat or anything other than what my gut told me it was. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing it in my mind, that fluid motion, the way it cleared that log, the sound of that dog yelping. The next morning I rode back to the bridge. I told myself I was being stupid, that in daylight everything would make sense. But I couldn't bring myself to cross to the Oklahoma side. I just stood there, staring across the water at those trees and that fallen log in the distance. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But I knew. A couple days later, I overheard some guys at the gas station talking about someone losing 2 hunting dogs out by the river. One had come home eventually, but it wouldn't go back into the woods. The other was just gone. The owner thought maybe it had tangled with a wild hog or fallen through ice into the river. I almost said something then. Almost. But what would I say? That I saw Bigfoot kill his dog? That I watched some impossible creature outrun his prized hunting dogs like they were standing still? So I kept my mouth shut. For 45 years I've kept my mouth shut. I've read accounts of other sightings since then. I've looked at blurry photos and watched shaky videos, and none of them capture what I saw. None of them show how it moved, how unnaturally fast and graceful it was for something so big. How it belonged in those woods in a way we never will. I've never gone hunting since that day, haven't been able to, and I've never gone back to the old toll bridge. Sometimes I dream about it though, standing there on those worn planks, watching ice drift by, hearing those dogs start to howl in the distance. In the dreams, I always try to run before it appears, but I never make it to my bike in time. I don't know what I saw that December day in '76. I don't want to know anymore, but sometimes when I hear dogs barking at night, especially when they suddenly go quiet, I remember. And I wonder if that second dog remembers too. Story 15. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I need to tell someone about what happened to me last summer. I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and I haven't been camping since. My buddy Mark owns this beautiful piece of land near Steelville, Missouri, right along the Merrimack River. He's always telling me I should come out and camp there, saying how peaceful it is. After a particularly stressful month at work, I finally decided to take him up on the offer. I wanted to be alone with my thoughts, away from people and electronics, just me and nature for a weekend. Man, if I had known what was waiting for me out there. I arrived Friday afternoon, early enough to set up camp before dark. The spot was gorgeous, a nice clearing about 30 yards from the river with tall trees surrounding it. I brought my oversized 4-person tent, even though it was just me, for the extra space, and set it up near the tree line. I'm pretty methodical about my camping setup, so I arranged my food in these clear plastic tubs with snap-on lids and put my perishables in a decent-sized cooler, placing everything just outside my tent where I could easily access it. The afternoon was perfect. I built a small fire, cooked some beans and hot dogs for dinner, and just relaxed in my camp chair watching the flames. The sun set around 8:30 and darkness gradually settled in. That's when things started feeling different. At first, it was just the normal night sounds, crickets, frogs near the river, the occasional rustle of leaves. But around 10 o'clock, I started hearing movement that didn't fit. It wasn't the wind, and it didn't sound like small animals. It was deliberate, heavy movement, just beyond where my vision ended in the darkness. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, probably just a deer or maybe even a wild hog. But something about the way the sounds moved, stopping and starting, almost like it was circling my campsite, made my skin crawl. I decided to call it a night, but I wasn't about to turn off all my lights. I left my battery-powered lantern burning just outside my tent door, giving me some sense of security as I zipped myself into the tent. I climbed into my sleeping bag fully clothed, even keeping my boots within arm's reach. Looking back, I think I already knew something wasn't right. For about 30 minutes, everything was quiet. I was just starting to think I'd overreacted when I heard it. Heavy footsteps approaching from the direction of the woods. Not sneaking, not trying to be quiet, just walking directly toward my campsite. My heart instantly began hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent, near where I'd left my food containers. I held my breath, afraid that whatever was out there would hear me. That's when I saw it. The lantern I'd left outside cast a shadow across my tent wall, a massive, unmistakable silhouette. Whatever was standing there had to be at least 8.5 feet tall. It had wide shoulders and unusually long arms that hung down past where its knees would be. The posture was straight, almost rigid. Definitely not a bear on its hind legs. Bears have a distinctive hunched shape, and this was something else entirely. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even think clearly. The shadow shifted as the thing moved toward my food supplies, just 5 feet from where I lay. I heard plastic containers being opened, the snap of lids being removed, the sound of plastic crinkling, my bread bag being handled, was crystal clear in the night air. Then came a sound that still haunts my nightmares. It was a deep, throaty growl, not aggressive exactly, more like satisfied. It was deep, deeper than any human voice could go, and it had this resonance that I could feel in my chest. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion or any wildlife I've ever heard in my 20 years of outdoor activities. The creature dumped over my cooler next. I could hear the ice shifting and the plastic hitting the ground. There was the distinct sound of packaging being torn open, the steaks I'd brought for the weekend, vacuum-sealed packages of pork and beef that were supposed to be Saturday and Sunday's dinner. I was completely paralyzed with fear. I didn't dare move, didn't even want to breathe too loudly. Through the thin fabric of my tent, I could hear what sounded like chewing, then more rustling through my supplies. It went on for what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 or 10 minutes. Finally, the shadow moved away from my tent, back toward the trees. The footsteps were heavy, but oddly quiet for something so large. No twigs snapping, just the soft compression of earth under significant weight. I thought it was over. I thought it was leaving. But about 15 minutes later, I heard something that made my blood run cold all over again. From the direction of the river came these vocalizations, these sounds that I can't even properly describe. They were long, drawn-out calls that started low and rose in pitch before falling again. They weren't howls exactly, and definitely not any bird or mammal call I've ever heard in Missouri wilderness. The closest thing I can compare it to is if you took a human moan and stretched it out, made it louder and more powerful, with this undertone that seemed to vibrate the air itself. The calls continued on and off for about an hour. Sometimes there would be just one, sometimes what sounded like a response from further away. I lay there, paralyzed, straining to hear any sign that the creature was coming back to my tent. I didn't sleep a wink that entire night. I just lay there, every muscle tense, waiting for dawn. When the first light of morning finally came filtering through my tent fabric, I still didn't move immediately. I waited until the sun was fully up before I dared to unzip my tent. The scene outside confirmed everything. My plastic food containers were scattered around the campsite, their lids pried off and contents disturbed. My bread was still there, but the bag had teeth marks punched through the plastic. Not the kind of teeth marks a raccoon or a possum would leave, but large punctures spaced like human teeth, only bigger. The cooler was on its side. The ice mostly melted into a puddle on the ground, and every single steak I had packed was gone. My hands were shaking as I surveyed the damage. There were indistinct marks on the ground around my camp, but nothing I could definitively call a footprint. The soil was too hard and covered with leaves, but I had a hunch, so I walked down to the riverside where the ground was sandier. That's where I found them, footprints pressed into the damp sand along the river's edge. They were unmistakably foot-shaped, with 5 toes, but massive, at least 17 inches long and incredibly wide. I wear a size 11 boot, and these prints dwarfed mine when I placed my foot next to one for comparison. The stride length between prints was enormous, easily 5 to 6 feet apart. I stood there staring at those footprints, my mind racing. Every logical explanation I tried to come up with fell apart. It wasn't a bear. The prints were nothing like bear tracks. It wasn't a person playing a prank. Nobody could fake prints that deep in the sand without some kind of apparatus, and the movements I'd witnessed were too fluid, too natural. I hadn't brought a camera. I'd wanted to disconnect completely. And now I was kicking myself. Who would believe this without evidence? I didn't even have my phone with me. It was locked in my car's glove box. I didn't waste any time packing up. What should have been a relaxing weekend in nature turned into me, frantically shoving my tent and supplies into my car, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every rustle in the trees made me jump. I was out of there within an hour, driving way too fast down the gravel road back to civilization. I didn't tell Mark about what happened. How do you tell someone that some kind of 8-foot-tall creature ransacked your camp and stole your food? I haven't told anyone until now. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a black bear that seemed bigger in the darkness and fear. But then I remember those footprints in the sand, those long arms, that straight posture, and those sounds from the river. Normal wildlife doesn't explain any of that. It's been almost a year, and I still haven't been camping again. Mark keeps asking when I'm coming back to his property, saying I seemed to leave in a hurry last time. I always make up some excuse. How do I tell him that his peaceful piece of Missouri wilderness is home to something that science says shouldn't exist? And worse, how do I deal with the fact that whatever it was, it knows human behavior enough to wait until dark, to go for the food containers, to open packages? That's what scares me most. Not just that it exists, but that it seems to understand us. I don't know what I encountered that night by the Merrimack River, but I know this: I'm never going camping alone again. And if you're out in those woods and hear something moving around your camp after dark, something big that walks on 2 legs and makes sounds no animal should make, get in your car and drive away. Don't wait until morning like I did. Story 16. I still have trouble trying to explain what happened to me and my cousin in November 2009. I've been hunting my entire life, so I know every sound and movement in the forest. This wasn't anything I've ever encountered before or since. We'd planned this deer hunting trip in northern Idaho for months. Jake and I had been hunting together since we were teenagers, and we both needed some time away from our jobs and everyday stress. We'd found this perfect spot a few years back. Remote, hardly any other hunters around, and good deer movement. The area was about 30 miles from the nearest town, deep in the national forest, with nothing but wilderness in every direction. We drove up on a Thursday morning, following this old logging road until it basically disappeared. We hiked about 3 miles with all our gear, setting up camp on this ridge above a drainage area. The spot was perfect. We could glass the entire valley below us and had a good vantage point. We set up our 2-man tent, organized our supplies, and got a small fire going to heat up some food, normal hunting trip stuff. The weather was pretty cold, maybe 35 degrees during the day, dropping into the 20s at night, but we were prepared with proper clothing and sleeping bags. The first night was uneventful. Just the usual sounds of the forest, some distant owls, and the wind through the trees. The next morning we decided to split up to cover more ground. This was something we'd done countless times before. Jake would head north along the ridge, and I would work my way down into the drainage. We agreed to meet back at camp around 2 in the afternoon. My morning was quiet. I saw some deer sign, fresh tracks and droppings, but nothing worth taking a shot at. Just a few does and a spike buck that was too small. The forest felt normal, peaceful even. Around 1:30 I started heading back to camp. When I got there, Jake was already sitting by the fire, looking uneasy. I immediately noticed something was off about him. He's usually talkative, joking around, but he was quiet, almost nervous. I dropped my pack and asked him what was up. "I heard something weird out there," he said, keeping his voice low like he was afraid of being overheard. "Really weird." I asked him to explain, figuring he'd just heard a moose or maybe even a bear. We'd encountered bears before, and while they demanded respect, they weren't anything we couldn't handle. "I was working my way along that northern slope," he said, pointing, "when I started hearing these movements, heavy, like something big was walking parallel to me, just inside the thicker timber." I nodded, still thinking bear, but it wasn't moving like a bear, Jake continued. It was deliberate, like it was pacing me. And then I heard this sound. He paused, looking embarrassed, like a grunt, but deeper than anything I've ever heard. Made my chest vibrate. I tried to brush it off, suggesting it was probably a moose or elk, but Jake shook his head. "I've heard every sound those animals make. This wasn't that, and whatever it was big, really big." I could tell he was genuinely unsettled, which was unusual for him. Jake wasn't someone who spooked easily. We decided to hunt together for the evening, just to be safe. Part of me thought he was overreacting, but another part was starting to feel uneasy too. We grabbed our rifles and moved to a spot at the edge of a clearing about half a mile from camp. It was a good area where deer often came out to feed in the evening. We sat against a fallen log, our eyes scanning the tree line across the clearing. As the light started to fade, the forest grew quieter, that normal transition time when day animals bed down and night creatures haven't yet emerged. The temperature was dropping fast, and I remember checking my watch. It was around 5:30, the sun already behind the mountains. That's when we heard it. This deep, guttural grunt rolled out from the trees across the clearing. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard in my 20 years of hunting. It was low and powerful, and I swear I could feel it in my chest, just like Jake had described earlier. We both froze, our eyes locked on the area where the sound had come from. Then came the crashes. Something big was moving through the brush on the other side of the clearing, not the careful movement of a deer or even the confident stride of a bear. This was powerful. Branches breaking, underbrush being pushed aside. We could see the tops of smaller trees swaying with the movement, but the fading light made it impossible to see what was causing it. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my hand tightening around my rifle. Jake didn't answer. He was staring intently at the tree line, his face pale even in the dim light. The grunting came again, followed by what sounded almost like wood knocking against wood. 2 sharp cracks. Then silence. We sat completely still for maybe 5 minutes. The forest had gone dead quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just absolute silence. Then it started moving again. We could hear it circling the edge of the clearing, still hidden in the trees. The steps were heavy enough that I could almost feel them through the ground. Whatever this was, it was huge. "We need to go," Jake whispered. "Now." We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on the tree line. Once we were in the cover of the forest, we turned and moved quickly back toward our camp, constantly looking over our shoulders. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. We were about halfway back to camp when we heard it again. The same grunting sound, but now it was behind us, coming from the direction we'd just left. It was following us. When we reached camp, we didn't even discuss what to do. We just started grabbing essential gear, our sleeping bags, some food, water bottles, and of course our rifles. There was no way we were spending the night there. As we hastily packed, the sounds continued, but now they were coming from 2 different directions. One set of heavy movements and occasional grunts from the north, and another from the east. The realization hit us both at the same time. There were at least 2 of them, and they were circling our camp. "We need to get out of here right now," Jake said, zipping his backpack closed. His voice was shaking. "We left most of our gear behind. The tent, cooking equipment, extra clothes. Stuff we could replace. We only took what we could quickly pack and what we absolutely needed. As we started down the ridge toward the logging road, the sounds followed us. Whatever these things were, they were pacing us on both sides, staying just inside the tree line, where we couldn't see them clearly in the growing darkness. The grunts continued, seemingly as a way to communicate with each other. Occasionally, one would make a sound that was almost like a wood knock, a sharp crack that echoed through the trees. I've never moved so fast through difficult terrain. We were practically jogging down this steep, rocky ridge in near darkness, only using our headlamps when absolutely necessary. The fear of tripping and injuring ourselves was outweighed by the fear of whatever was following us. The worst moment came when we were about a mile from the truck. We had to cross a small stream, and as we were picking our way across the slippery rocks, something large crashed through the brush directly behind us. It sounded like it was right there, maybe 20 yards back. Then came this grunt that was so powerful and so close that it seemed to vibrate the air around us. Jake slipped on the rocks, falling knee-deep into the cold water. I grabbed his arm, pulling him up, and we scrambled up the bank on the other side. We didn't stop to check if his gear got wet or if he was hurt. We just kept moving. When we finally reached the logging road and saw the outline of the truck in the moonlight, it was the biggest relief I've ever felt. We threw our packs in the bed and jumped inside, fumbling with the keys. As Jake started the engine and turned on the headlights, I swear I saw movement at the edge of the trees. Something large and dark that quickly moved back into the shadows. We drove for about 20 minutes in complete silence, the truck bouncing violently on the rough road. It wasn't until we hit the paved highway that Jake finally spoke. That wasn't a bear. His voice was flat, certain. No, I agreed. Way too big. Or moose. Yeah. Another few minutes of silence passed before he said it out loud. You know what that was, right? I nodded slowly. Sasquatch. It sounds ridiculous saying it, even now. Before that night, I'd always laughed at Bigfoot stories. I was skeptical about every viral video or blurry photo. But after what we experienced, I know they're out there. We ended up driving all the way home that night, 3 hours in the dark, neither of us wanting to stop anywhere. We went back 2 weeks later with a larger group to retrieve the rest of our gear. Nothing happened on that trip. No strange sounds, no feelings of being watched. But I'll never hunt in that area again. I still hunt, but I'm hyper-aware now of every sound in the forest. Every broken branch makes me freeze. Every unexpected movement in the trees makes my heart race. Whatever was in those woods that night wanted us gone from its territory, and it succeeded. The thing that haunts me most isn't just what I heard, but what I felt. That primal fear, that absolute certainty that we were being hunted by something ancient and powerful that didn't want us there. Something that could have easily taken us if it wanted to, but instead chose to drive us away. I've never talked about this publicly before. I don't need people thinking I'm crazy or making things up. But I know what I experienced. There are things in the deep woods that most people will never see or hear, things that have been there long before us and will remain long after we're gone. And sometimes, if you venture too far into their territory, they let you know it's time to leave. Story 17. I've sat on this for about 8 months, debating whether to even put this experience out there because I know how it sounds, but it's been eating away at me, and I need to tell someone who might actually believe me or make sense of what I saw. Last fall, I planned a 4-day solo hiking trip in the Olympic National Forest in Washington. I'd done plenty of solo trips before, and while friends always warned me about bears or cougars, I never really worried. I'm experienced, carry bear spray, know what to do in wildlife encounters, all that stuff. What I wasn't prepared for was, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. It was my 2nd day out. I had set up a nice little campsite near a creek. Nothing fancy, just my 1-person tent, a small cooking area, and my gear hung properly away from camp. The weather was perfect that day, mid-50s, partly cloudy, that crisp fall air that makes the Pacific Northwest so magical in autumn. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to explore a bit before starting dinner. I grabbed my small day pack with water, a few protein bars, my knife, bear spray and headlamp, just in case, and headed out. My campsite was in a small clearing about 50 yards from the creek, and I decided to follow a game trail I'd spotted earlier that seemed well-traveled. The forest there is dense, towering Douglas firs, western hemlocks and underbrush, thick enough that you can't see very far in most directions. The trail meandered through it all, occasionally opening up into small clearings before diving back into the shadows. I was maybe a mile from camp, just enjoying the quiet and taking mental notes of interesting mushrooms I spotted. I'm a bit of an amateur mycologist. When everything changed. It was around 4:30, or maybe 5. The light was starting to get that golden hour quality, filtering through the trees in shafts that illuminated the forest mist. I rounded a slight bend in the trail, and that's when I noticed them. 2 orbs of light floating about 40 yards ahead of me. At first, I thought it was just sunlight reflecting off something, or maybe my eyes playing tricks. But as I watched, I realized these were actually self-illuminating objects moving independently through the forest. The first was roughly the size of a grapefruit, glowing with this soft white-blue light that seemed to pulse slightly. Behind it, maybe 3 feet back, was a smaller orb, about the size of a golf ball, flickering almost like it was struggling to maintain its form. I froze in my tracks. These things were moving with purpose, weaving around tree trunks and ducking under branches like they knew exactly where they were going. They didn't float in straight lines, but moved in these fluid, almost organic patterns. I remember thinking they looked almost intelligent in how they navigated. I didn't feel scared exactly, more completely bewildered. I've been in these forests for years and never seen anything remotely like this. I stood perfectly still, barely breathing, watching as they continued their path through the trees. After about a minute, maybe less, they both just winked out. Not like they moved behind something or faded away gradually. They literally disappeared mid-movement, like someone had flipped a switch. I stayed rooted to the spot, waiting to see if they'd reappear. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After a couple of minutes with no sign of them, I started questioning if I'd actually seen anything at all. Was it some weird atmospheric phenomenon? Ball lightning? Though I know that doesn't typically behave that way. My mind was racing with explanations, none of them satisfying. After about 5 minutes, I decided to continue down the trail, moving cautiously. I kept looking for the orbs, scanning the trees ahead of me, but they were gone. The forest had returned to its normal state of quiet rustling and occasional bird calls. But then, maybe 5 or 10 minutes after the orbs disappeared, everything went silent. It was that unnatural silence that seasoned outdoors people know means something is wrong. No birds, no insects buzzing, nothing, just dead silence except for my own breathing and footsteps. Then I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't subtle either. It was that primal, hair-raising feeling that something with intention has its eyes fixed on you. I stopped walking and slowly began scanning the trees around me, moving my head in small, deliberate movements. That's when I saw it. About 30 yards to my left, partially obscured behind an enormous Douglas fir, was a figure. At first, I could only make out a dark shape, but as my eyes focused, I realized what I was looking at. It stood at least 7 feet tall, towering even behind that massive tree trunk. Its body was covered in thick, shaggy brown hair, or fur that looked almost reddish where the fading sunlight hit it. What I could see of its face is burned into my memory. It had this prominent brow ridge that shadowed its eyes, but I could clearly make out these deep-set, almost black bead-like eyes staring directly at me. They didn't look animal-like exactly, but they weren't human either. They held awareness, intelligence. We stood there, completely motionless, just observing each other for what must have been 30 seconds, but felt like an eternity. My mind was racing through everything I'd ever heard about Bigfoot encounters. Don't run, don't approach, don't make threatening movements. So I just stood there, barely breathing, my hand instinctively hovering near my bear spray, though I had no intention of using it. This creature didn't appear aggressive or frightened, just watchful, curious even. Then something changed. Its gaze shifted slightly, looking past me rather than at me. Its massive head turned slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, with a deliberateness that still haunts me, it simply stepped behind the tree and vanished. I know how that sounds. A 7-foot creature can't just disappear. But that's exactly what happened. I waited, expecting to see movement, to hear the crash of underbrush as it moved away. Nothing. Complete silence. I stood frozen for another minute, then slowly began backing up the way I'd come, never taking my eyes off that tree. I didn't turn my back until I'd put at least 50 yards between us. Then I walked quickly back toward my camp, constantly checking behind me, scanning the trees on either side of the trail, my heart hammering in my chest. When I reached my campsite, I immediately gathered everything I might need for the night: food, water, my knife, headlamp, and bear spray, and brought it all into my tent. I know it's against conventional wisdom to have food in your tent, but there was no way I was going back out there in the growing darkness to hang my food bag. I spent the night wide awake, listening to every sound in the forest. Several times I thought I heard heavy footsteps circling my campsite, but it could have been my imagination working overtime. At first light, I packed up and hiked out, taking a different trail than the one where I'd had my encounter. Here's the thing that's been haunting me for months now: the connection between those orbs and the Bigfoot. Before this, I'd never associated these creatures with any kind of paranormal phenomena. I'd always figured if they existed, they were just some undiscovered primate species. But experiencing both within minutes of each other, in the same location, it seems too coincidental to dismiss. I've researched extensively since then and found scattered reports linking Bigfoot sightings with strange lights or orbs, but nothing concrete enough to form a theory. Were the orbs somehow related to the creature? Were they leading me to it, or it to me? Or was it just bizarre coincidence? What gets me is how intentional everything felt. Those orbs moved with purpose. The Bigfoot observed me with clear intelligence. None of it felt random or accidental. It felt like an encounter that was meant to happen. I haven't gone back to that specific area since, though I've continued hiking in other parts of Washington. But I don't go alone anymore, and I don't stay overnight. Something fundamental changed for me in that forest. The certainty I once had about what exists in our world and what doesn't has been completely shattered. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know how it sounds. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I'd have nodded politely while internally rolling my eyes, but I know what I saw. Those eyes looking at me from behind that tree weren't the eyes of any recognized animal species. And those orbs weren't any natural phenomenon I've ever heard of. The wilderness feels different to me now, bigger, stranger, full of possibilities I never considered before. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. All I know is that for about 30 seconds, on an ordinary fall day, I stood face to face with something that shouldn't exist according to science. And it looked back at me with equal curiosity. And I have no idea what to do with that experience. Tai Sita D, Story 18. I've never told this story outside my family because most people would think I'm either lying or crazy. But I need to get this off my chest because it's haunted me for years. I know what I saw that day in the woods behind my childhood home, and it wasn't anything that should exist in our world. I grew up in a small town in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by dense forests and mountains. My grandfather was an avid hunter, and I grew up listening to him and his hunting buddies swap stories around campfires or at our kitchen table. They'd talk about tracking deer, fishing trips gone wrong, and occasionally in hushed tones after a few beers, they'd mention encounters with something they couldn't explain. It was at least 8 feet tall, one of my grandpa's friends would say, his eyes wide with remembered fear. Walked like a man but covered in thick black hair, stank like nothing I've ever smelled before. Another would nod solemnly. I heard it scream once, sounded like a woman being murdered, but deeper, louder, made my blood freeze. As a kid, I rolled my eyes at these stories. Adults making up scary tales to entertain themselves or to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods alone. I was too smart to believe in monsters. When I turned 10, my grandfather gave me a bike for my birthday. Nothing fancy, just a second-hand mountain bike he'd fixed up. It was forest green with black handlebars, and I loved that thing more than anything I'd ever owned. It meant freedom. Behind our house was a network of dirt trails that snaked through the woods. Most were made by deer, but some were wide enough for a bike. I spent that whole summer exploring those trails, mapping them in my head, finding the fastest routes and the best jumps. There was one trail, though, that I always avoided. It branched off from the main path about a half-mile into the woods, heading deeper into a section where the trees grew closer together, blocking out most of the sunlight. Even on bright days, that trail seemed darker, colder somehow. I can't explain why, but something about it just felt wrong. Then, in late August, a new family moved into the house on the other side of the woods. They had a son my age named Ethan, and we became friends almost instantly. The problem was, to get to his house, I had to either ride my bike 2 miles around the forest on the main road or take that trail I'd been avoiding. Taking the trail would cut the journey to about 15 minutes. After a week of taking the long way, I decided I was being stupid. It was just a trail. I was 10 years old, practically grown up. I wasn't going to let some dumb feeling stop me from hanging out with my friend. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late summer when I finally decided to take the shortcut. The day had started out perfectly normal. Bright blue skies, warm but not hot, barely any wind. I remember checking the time before I left, 1:15 in the afternoon. Because my mum told me I had to be back for dinner at 6, I rode into the forest confidently, feeling the familiar bumps and dips of the main trail beneath my tires. When I reached the fork where the shortcut branched off, I hesitated for just a moment before turning onto it. The temperature seemed to drop immediately. The canopy was thicker here, filtering the sunlight into weak green beams that barely reached the forest floor. The trail was narrower too, with roots crossing it that I had to carefully navigate. I'd been riding for about 5 minutes when it happened. The first thing I felt was like an electric shock running from the top of my head down my spine. It wasn't painful exactly, more like that feeling when your foot falls asleep but spread throughout my whole body. I almost fell off my bike, managing to catch myself at the last second. That's when I noticed the silence. Usually, the woods were filled with sounds. Birds chirping, squirrels rustling in the underbrush, the distant drumming of woodpeckers. But now there was nothing. Absolute stillness. The air felt thick, heavy, like right before a massive thunderstorm. As if responding to my thought, the sky darkened dramatically. I looked up through the trees and saw storm clouds gathering, but in a way I'd never seen before. They were swirling, almost like they were being pulled toward a central point directly above me. Then the rain started. Not a gentle shower, but an instant downpour so heavy I could barely see 10 feet ahead. I was soaked in seconds. The trail quickly turned to mud, and my bike tires started to sink into it. I tried to pedal faster, but it felt like riding through molasses. My legs strained against an invisible resistance. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that made the ground vibrate beneath me. At first, I thought it must be a bear, and my heart nearly stopped. But bears don't walk on two legs, and whatever was approaching was definitely bipedal. The footsteps were too spaced out, too rhythmic to be anything on four legs. I tried to move faster, but my bike wouldn't budge. It was like the wheels were glued to the ground. I couldn't even get off. My feet felt frozen to the pedals. All I could do was sit there, rain streaming down my face, listening to those footsteps getting closer and closer. That's when I saw it step out from between two massive Douglas firs about 20 yards ahead of me on the trail. Even through the curtain of rain, I could make out its massive shape, at least 10 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung almost to its knees. It was covered in thick, shaggy black hair that clung to its body in the downpour. But it was its eyes that made me feel like I might pass out from fear. They were glowing a bright, eerie green that cut through the gloom like flashlights. They fixed on me immediately, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at something intelligent, something aware. It let out a sound, not quite a roar, not quite a scream, that made every hair on my body stand on end. The noise seemed to vibrate through my chest, like standing too close to a massive speaker. Then it started stomping toward me, each footfall making the mud splash up around its massive feet. I tried to scream, but couldn't. I tried to turn my bike around, but still couldn't move. All I could do was sit there, sobbing, as this impossible creature approached me. I remember thinking about my mom, how she wouldn't know what happened to me, how they'd probably never find my body. When it was about 10 feet away, I managed to find my voice. "I'm sorry," I blubbered, tears and rain mixing on my face. "I'm sorry for coming here. This is your place. I didn't mean to. Please let me go." The creature stopped. It cocked its head to one side like a confused dog. The anger in its posture seemed to recede slightly, replaced by what looked almost like curiosity. It made a different sound then, a series of deep clicks and whistles that made no sense to me, but clearly meant something. That's when I noticed movement to my right. A second creature emerged from the trees, this one smaller, maybe 8 feet tall, with brown hair instead of black. Its eyes were different too, solid black, like pools of oil. It approached the first creature and made similar clicking sounds, only higher pitched. They seemed to be arguing. The smaller one kept gesturing toward me with long, powerful arms, while the larger one stomped and shook its massive head. This went on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. Finally, the smaller one placed a hand on the larger one's arm. The black-haired creature let out what sounded like a sigh, a surprisingly human sound, before turning and stomping back into the forest. The brown-haired one looked at me for a long moment, its black eyes impossible to read, before following its companion. As soon as they disappeared into the trees, everything changed. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had started. The dark clouds dispersed, letting sunlight filter through the canopy again. Birds resumed their singing as if they'd never stopped, and my bike could move again. I didn't waste a second. I started pedaling as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest, expecting at any moment to hear those heavy footsteps returning. The mud that had seemed so thick and sticky moments before was now just normal wet dirt beneath my tires. I'd almost reached the end of the trail when I felt that electric shock sensation again, running up my spine and exploding in my head. The next thing I knew, I was flying over my handlebars, landing hard on my shoulder in a patch of ferns. I must have blacked out for a minute, because the next thing I remember is Ethan standing over me, asking if I was okay. He'd been waiting for me at his house, and when I didn't show up, he decided to walk down the trail to meet me halfway. I was scraped up, but nothing was broken. My bike was fine too, just a bit muddy. When Ethan asked what happened, I made up some story about hitting a root and flipping over. I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I'd really seen. When I got home, I discovered only an hour had passed since I'd left, even though it felt like I'd been in those woods for half the day. I never told my parents what happened. How could I? But a week later, I finally worked up the courage to tell my grandfather. He didn't laugh or tell me I was making it up. He just listened quietly, nodding occasionally, his face serious. When I finished, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Some things in this world ain't meant to be understood, kid. Some places ain't meant to be visited. You got lucky." We went back to that trail many times after that, my grandfather and I. He brought his hunting rifle, just in case. Though he never loaded it, we never saw anything strange. The trail was just a trail, a bit darker than the others maybe, but just trees and dirt and the occasional squirrel. But I know what I saw that day. I've spent years trying to make sense of it. The best I can figure is that somehow for a brief time I crossed into something else. Another dimension or reality where these creatures exist, or maybe they're always there, just beyond what we can normally perceive. And sometimes the veil between worlds gets thin enough that we can see through. I don't know. I'll probably never know. But I still get goosebumps when it rains suddenly on a clear day, and I still avoid hiking alone, especially in unfamiliar forests. Some instincts you just don't ignore after an experience like that.